Chapter 1. The Dying Light. Tech Adept. Vex Mortis had been monitoring the Golden Throne subsystems for 317 years, and he had never seen readings like these. The sacred cogitators flickered with warning runes that painted his mechanical features in angry red light, each one a prayer to the Omnissiah gone unanswered. His servo skull circled overhead like a carrion bird, its sensors recording data that made no sense according to any pattern in the archives. Fabricator General, he transmitted through the noospheric link, his binary cant edged with something that his emotion dampeners couldn't quite suppress. The psych conductors are failing, all of them. Kane's response came with the weight of 10,000 years of maintenance protocols behind it. Clarify failing, Adept. The throne has weathered worse storms. But Vex Mortis was looking at something no tech priest had ever seen before. The life support matrix wasn't just degrading. It was unraveling, layer by layer, like sacred parchment exposed to naked flame. The biorhythmic readings that had held steady for a millennium showed patterns of collapse that his augmented mind could barely process. Where there should have been the steady thrum of the God Emperor's eternal vigil, there was something else. Something that sounded, if servo skulls could be said to perceive such things, like screaming. In the chamber above, Lord Commander Militant Udin Macht Udo felt the change before any instrument could measure it. He'd been in the presence of the Golden Throne exactly 7 times in his life, each visit a profound spiritual experience that left him humbled and renewed. This time was different. The air itself felt wrong, too thin, too sharp, like breathing razors. The massive doors of auramite and adamantium seemed smaller somehow, as if the space around them was contracting. The custodian who had escorted him here stood rigid at his post, but Udo caught the subtle shift in his stance. Guardian Valerius had been born into this duty, had known nothing but the defense of this sacred place, and yet something in his bearing suggested a kind of confusion that Udo had never associated with the Emperor's chosen guardians. "My lord," Valerius spoke quietly, his voice carrying a tremor that might have been the deck plating vibrating under their feet. "Perhaps we should—" The words were cut off by a sound that had no place in the Imperial Palace. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a resonance that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and echo in the bones. Udo had heard the roar of Orc attack moons positioning themselves in Terra's orbit. He had heard the death scream of hive cities as they fell to the green tide. This was something else, entirely. 3 levels below, in the archives where only the highest-ranking tech marines were permitted to tread, Zagreus Kane stood before a display that showed him the slow death of everything he had sworn to preserve. The sacred patterns that had maintained the God Emperor's corporeal form for 10 millennia were unspooling like a tapestry, pulled apart, thread by thread. Each failing system triggered cascading failures in others, and Kane's vast experience told him what his rational mind refused to accept. This was not mechanical failure. This was something far worse. His servo skull dropped from the air like a stone. Kane's augmented fingers moved across control surfaces that had been old when Terra was young, trying desperately to isolate the failing systems, to find some way to arrest the decay. But for every subsystem he managed to stabilize, 3 others began to falter. It was like trying to hold back the tide with his bare hands. The worst part was the sound. Kane's audio pickups had been filtering out the background hum of the throne for so long that he'd forgotten it was there, until it began to change. The steady rhythm that had been the heartbeat of the Imperium was becoming something ragged, irregular, and underneath it, barely perceptible even to his enhanced hearing, was something that sounded like voices. In the High Lord's council chamber, Grand Master of Assassins Fadix felt the change as a sudden chill that had nothing to do with temperature. He had spent his life learning to read the subtlest signs, the twitch of an eye that betrayed guilt, the pause in breathing that signaled deception. His trained instincts were screaming at him now, though he couldn't identify the source of the threat. The other High Lords seemed to sense it too. Ecclesiarch Messring's ceremonial incense had gone out, the flame dying as if starved of oxygen. Lord Admiral Lansung kept glancing toward the chamber's massive windows, though nothing was visible beyond them but the familiar sprawl of the palace districts. Master of the Astronomicon Jenisk sat perfectly still, but sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the chamber's climate controls. "My lords," Fadix said carefully, "perhaps we should consider—" The lights went out. Not just in the chamber, everywhere. The eternal illumination of the Imperial Palace, powered by fusion reactors buried deep in Terra's crust, simply ceased. For a moment that stretched like an eternity, the heart of the Imperium sat in perfect, absolute darkness. Then the emergency power kicked in, bathing everything in hellish red light, and Fadix saw Jenisk's face transform with an expression of horror he had never seen on another human being. "The Astronomicon," Jenisk whispered, his voice barely audible. It's gone." In the depths of the palace, Vex Mortis watched his instruments die one by one. The sacred machinery that had maintained the God Emperor's vigil for 10,000 years was shutting down, and nothing in his vast databanks offered any protocol for this contingency. His servo skull lay motionless on the deck, its machine spirit fled or destroyed. The psych conductors that channeled the Emperor's will across the galaxy were going dark. The biorhythmic monitors showed patterns that made no sense according to any medical knowledge, human or posthuman. And from somewhere deep in the throne chamber itself came a sound that Vex Mortis had never heard before, but which his human genetic memory recognized with primal terror. It was the sound of something dying. Fabricator General Kane reached the chamber just as the final stabilization rituals failed completely. His optical sensors struggled to process what they were seeing. The Golden Throne wreathed in energies that had no place in real space, its ancient mechanisms convulsing like a dying animal. The massive form enthroned within was still there, still technically alive according to the few instruments that remained functional, but something fundamental had changed. The God Emperor of mankind was screaming. Not with his voice, that had been stilled since the heresy's end, but his psychic presence, the vast consciousness that had guided humanity for 10 millennia, was crying out in anguish that reverberated through the warp itself. Kane's psychic dampeners couldn't filter it out. His emotional suppressors couldn't dull the impact. Even his most sacred augmentations couldn't shield him from the raw, overwhelming sensation of witnessing the moment when a god began to die. Above them all, in the highest spire of the palace, Navigator House Belisarius felt their ancestral connection to the Emperor's light simply stop. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that had guided Imperial ships through the warp for 10,000 years, was fading like a candle in a hurricane. Navigatrix Octavia. Belisarius pressed her hands to her third eye and wept tears of blood as she felt the galaxy's guiding light go out forever. On Terra's orbital platforms, Admiral Lansung received the reports with growing horror. The Orcatak moons had detected the same energy readings that were driving their instruments mad, and they were moving. All of them. Converging on Terra with a purpose that spoke of terrible intelligence behind their crude construction. The beast, it seemed, understood what was happening even if the Imperium did not. In the council chamber, the High Lord sat in stunned silence as reports flooded in from across Terra. Power fluctuations in the palace, mass hysteria among the astropathic choirs, emergency broadcasts from orbital defense stations reporting gravitometric anomalies in the space around the throne chamber itself, and from the depths of the palace, carried by terrified Vox transmissions from tech adepts whose emotional dampeners had failed completely, came the impossible truth that none of them wanted to accept. The Golden Throne was dying, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Ecclesiarch Mesring fell to his knees and began to pray, his voice lost in the sudden cacophony of alarms that were sounding across the imperial palace. But even his prayers seemed hollow now, words spoken into a void where the God Emperor's presence had been. Lord Admiral Lansung was already moving toward the chamber's communications array, knowing that he needed to warn the fleet elements, still fighting in Terra's outer system. If the Astronomicon was truly gone, if the God Emperor was truly dying, then every ship in the Imperium was suddenly blind and alone in the darkness of space. Grandmaster Fadek sat perfectly still, his assassin's mind cataloguing threat responses and contingency protocols with mechanical precision. But underneath his professional calm, a single thought repeated itself with growing urgency. If the God Emperor died, if the Golden Throne failed, then everything, the Imperium, humanity, the war against chaos itself, would die with him. In the throne chamber, Fabricator General Kane watched the last of the life support systems fade to black. The God Emperor's body remained on the throne, but something essential had left it. The psychic presence that had held the Imperium together through will alone was fragmenting, dispersing, becoming something else entirely. Kane's augmented hearing picked up a new sound then, not from the throne, but from somewhere far below. It was the sound of something massive and ancient, straining against bonds that had held for 10,000 years. The webway breach, sealed by the Emperor's will since the days of the heresy, was stirring. And in the warp, things that had been held at bay by the God Emperor's power for 100 centuries began to move toward Terra with hungry purpose. The dying light of the Astronomicon flickered once more and then went dark forever, leaving the galaxy blind in the darkness between the stars. On Terra, in the heart of the Imperium, the Golden Throne fell silent for the first time in 10 millennia. The God Emperor of mankind was dead, and in the depths of space around Terra, the beast's attack moons began their final approach. Chapter 2. The Webway Unleashed Custodian. Valerius felt it first as a vibration in the ancient stones beneath his feet, a tremor that seemed to rise from the very foundations of the imperial palace. He had stood guard in these halls for 3 centuries, and the palace had always been solid, eternal, unchanging as the stars themselves. Now the floor beneath him buckled like the deck of a ship in a storm. The sound came next, not from any direction he could identify, but from everywhere at once. A tearing noise, like reality itself being ripped apart at the seams. His guardian spear hummed to life in his grip, its power field crackling with energy that cast dancing shadows on the corridor walls. But there was nothing to fight. Not yet. "All stations," he voxed to his brother custodians, his voice steady despite what his superhuman senses were telling him. "Report status." The responses came back, fragmented, confused. Guard Captain Aquilon's voice carried an edge that Valerius had never heard before. "Sub-level 7. Something's happening to the walls. They're changing." 12 levels below, in the deepest dungeons of the Imperial Palace, Tech Adept Kef 9 watched his instruments die one by one as something that had no place in real space began to manifest. The containment barriers that had held Magnus the Red's breach, sealed for 10 millennia, were failing, unraveling like wet parchment under the strain of forces that made his mechanical mind recoil in horror. The breach itself was invisible to normal sight, just a shimmering distortion in the air, like heat haze rising from sun-baked rockcrete. But Ceph-9's augmented vision could see the true extent of it, the way it carved through multiple dimensions at once, creating a wound in the fabric of existence itself. And through that wound, things were beginning to push. They came as shadows first, dark shapes that moved against the light in ways that hurt to observe. Ceph-9's optical sensors struggled to process what they were seeing, his pattern recognition systems throwing error codes as they tried to catalogue entities that violated every law of physics. His servo skulls circled in agitated spirals before simply dropping from the air, their machine spirits fled or destroyed. The first demon to fully manifest was something that might have once been human. It stood 9 feet tall, its form wreathed in tattered fabric that moved without any wind, and when it turned its attention to Ceph-9, he felt his sanity dampeners engage automatically. The thing's face was a constantly shifting kaleidoscope of expressions: rage, hunger, ecstasy, despair, cycling through them too quickly for any mortal mind to follow. 10,000 years, it spoke, its voice a harmony of screams. 10,000 years we have waited behind his failing light. Ceph-9 tried to trigger the containment protocols, his mechadendrite tentacles dancing across control surfaces that suddenly felt alien under his touch. But the systems that had held the breach, sealed for 100 centuries, were already dead, their sacred circuits burned out by energies that had no name in any human language. More demons poured through the widening gap, each one worse than the last. Some were giants of brass and flame that left molten footprints in the ancient stone. Others were shifting masses of tentacles and eyes that seemed to exist in too many dimensions at once. All of them moved with terrible purpose toward the upper levels of the palace. Guard Captain Aquilon reached the breach chamber just as the first wave of demons began to spread into the surrounding corridors. He had seen many things in his centuries of service: Xenos horrors, traitor space marines, the worst that the galaxy could produce. But nothing had prepared him for this. The very air in the chamber writhed with malevolent energy, and the walls themselves seemed to be weeping blood that had never been shed by mortal veins. "Throne and blood," he breathed, raising his guardian spear. The weapon's power field flared brighter in response to the unholy presence, its sacred machine spirit recognizing the ancient enemy. All custodians to sub-level 7. Emergency protocol Crimson. The battle was joined before his transmission finished. A thing of living shadow with too many teeth lunged at him from the breach, moving faster than anything that size should have been able to. Aquilon's spear took it through what might have been its center of mass, the blessed blade parting demonic flesh like mist. But even as it dissolved into nothingness, 3 more took its place. Sister Superior Thessaly felt the wrongness like a physical blow as she led her squad of silent sisters down into the palace depths. Her null field blazed around her, a sphere of emptiness that made the demons recoil in pain and fury. But there were too many of them. For every one that her presence banished back to the warp, a dozen more poured through the ever-widening breach. The corridors that had been carved from living rock during the palace's construction now ran with substances that had never been part of any material universe. The air itself tasted of copper and ozone, and something else, something that reminded Thessaly of the moment just before lightning struck. Her psychic null field protected her from the worst of the warp's influence, but she could see what it was doing to the unprotected palace staff. Servitors wandered in circles, their programmed routines unable to process the chaos around them. Human menials fell to their knees, gibbering prayers to the God Emperor, even as their minds shattered under the weight of witnessing the impossible. Some simply stood still and screamed until their voices gave out. "Evacuation Protocol Ultima," Thessaly signaled through hand signs to her sisters. The Silent Sisterhood had trained for this scenario, though none of them had ever believed it would come to pass. If the webway breach could not be contained, then the palace itself would have to be abandoned. 3 levels above, Lord Commander Militant Udin Markt Udo received the evacuation order with a mixture of relief and horror. Relief that there was a plan, a protocol to follow in this impossible situation. Horror at what following that protocol would mean. The Imperial Palace had stood for 10,000 years as the beating heart of human civilization. To abandon it to the forces of chaos was unthinkable. But the alternatives were worse. All guard regiments. He spoke into his Vox unit, his voice cutting through the static and interference that was making long-range communication increasingly difficult. Begin immediate evacuation of Palace levels 1 through 50. Priority goes to tech adepts, administratum personnel, and civilian staff. Military personnel will maintain defensive positions until all non-combatants have reached the surface. The response was immediate and professional, but Udo could hear the strain in his officers' voices. They were asking their men to hold the line against entities that defied every tactical manual ever written, while shepherding civilians through corridors that were rapidly becoming hellscapes. It was, he realized, a task that would require martyrdom on a scale not seen since the heresy itself. In the palace's astropathic chambers, Choir Master Vox Eternal Kryn felt his mind touch something vast and malevolent as the psychic barriers that had protected Terra for millennia began to collapse. The astropaths under his command were screaming prophecies in languages that predated human civilization. Their enhanced minds suddenly flooded with visions of futures too terrible to contemplate. "The light dies!" shrieked astropath Transcendent Yolof, her voice echoing through the chamber, even though her throat had been cut out decades ago as part of her soul-binding ritual. The golden path ends in darkness. The throne world burns with unholy fire. Kryn tried to establish contact with the astropathic choirs on other worlds to warn them of what was happening, but the psychic network that connected the Imperium was in chaos. Where once there had been the steady pulse of the Astronomicon guiding Imperial communications across the void, there was now only screaming static, punctuated by the laughter of things that should not exist. More disturbing were the visions that his surviving astropaths were broadcasting. Images of the Emperor's physical form withering on the golden throne, of the palace overrun by demons, of Terra itself becoming a demon world. Kryn had enough experience with psychic phenomena to know that these were not metaphors or symbolic visions. They were glimpses of what was happening right now, in real time. Captain General Valdor's successor, a man whose name had been ritually purged from all records upon his ascension to the highest office of the Custodian Guard, stood in the palace's command center and watched the tactical displays show the impossible. Red icons representing demonic incursions were spreading through the lower levels like a plague, consuming corridor after corridor with inexorable purpose. Green icons representing Custodian and Imperial Guard positions were winking out one by one. "How long until full evacuation?" he asked his aide, a tech adept whose augmentations included direct neural links to the palace's communication network. 17 hours, my lord," came the response, spoken through Vox grills that crackled with interference. "Assuming current rates of civilian movement and no major complications." The Captain General looked at the tactical display again. At the current rate of demonic advance, They would reach the upper levels in less than 6 hours. The mathematics were brutally simple. They did not have enough time. "Signal all available Space Marine forces," he commanded. "Emergency protocols. Any chapter within range of Terra is to make immediate translation to the Sol system. We need reinforcements, and we need them now." The Tech Adept's response came with a burst of binary cant that the Captain General's limited knowledge of the machine tongue allowed him to interpret as profound pessimism. "My lord, with the Astronomicon dark, warp travel is problematic. Any vessels in the warp when the light failed are likely lost or corrupted." Through the palace's great windows, the Captain General could see the first signs of the demonic incursion reaching the surface levels. The sky above Terra had turned the color of old blood, and shapes that hurt to look at directly were beginning to manifest in the upper atmosphere. The Ork-attack moons that had been approaching for their final assault now seemed almost benign by comparison. In the depths of the palace, Guard Captain Aquilon made his last stand at the breach itself. His guardian spear had claimed the lives of dozens of demons, but for each one banished back to the warp, 10 more took its place. His golden armor was scored and blackened by unholy energies, and his strength, superhuman though it was beginning to fail. Around him, the remnants of his squad held a rapidly shrinking perimeter. Custodians who had stood against traitor Primarchs during the heresy were falling to creatures that should not have been able to exist in real space. The breach itself had grown until it filled nearly half the chamber, a gaping wound in reality through which the full fury of chaos poured like a river of madness. As the final demon wave overwhelmed his position, Aquilon triggered the chamber's self-destruct mechanism, a last resort that would collapse several levels of the palace in an attempt to contain the breach. The explosion shook the entire structure, bringing down corridors that had stood since the dark age of technology. But even as the debris settled, new demons were already clawing their way through the rubble. The breach could not be contained by physical force. It would require something far more drastic, something that no one in the Imperium was prepared to contemplate. Above them all, the former site of the Golden Throne Chamber had become something that no human eyes could safely witness. Where the God Emperor had maintained his eternal vigil for 10 millennia, reality itself was coming apart at the seams. The psychic energies released by his death were interacting with the webway breach in ways that turned the laws of physics into mere suggestions. And still the demons poured through, an endless tide of chaos given form and purpose. They spread through the palace like a cancer, corrupting everything they touched, turning humanity's greatest fortress into a bridgehead for forces that sought nothing less than the complete annihilation of the material universe. The evacuation continued, but everyone involved knew that it was too little, too late. The heart of the Imperium was lost, and with it, perhaps, humanity's last hope for survival. Chapter 3. The Emperor's Final Moment. Tech Adept Vex Mortis felt the Emperor's presence in his mind like a burning star going supernova. It started as a whisper, a voice that spoke through the static of his failing neural implants, words that came not through his audio pickups but directly into his consciousness. "My faithful servant," the voice said, and Vex Mortis fell to his knees as he recognized the psychic signature that had guided humanity for 10,000 years. "The time has come to speak the words I have carried in silence since Horus fell." Around the Golden Throne Chamber, the few surviving tech priests found themselves serving as living voxcasters for the God Emperor's final communion. Their augmented throats spoke in perfect unison, their individual consciousness subsumed into something infinitely greater and more terrible. To those who have served faithfully, the Emperor's voice echoed through their vocal cords. Know that your devotion has not been in vain. To those who will remember this day, understand that death is not the end of duty, but its transformation. Fabricator General Kane watched in horrified fascination as his subordinates became conduits for their dying deity. Their optical arrays blazed with golden light that had no technological source, their mechanical limbs moving in perfect synchronization as they performed one final maintenance ritual, not on the Golden Throne, but on the cosmos itself. I go now to a war that has raged since time began, the Emperor continued through a dozen mechanically modified throats. Remember that the light you thought came from the throne was never mine alone. It was yours, the faith of humanity given form. Guard it well. The psychic pressure in the chamber was becoming unbearable. Kane's emotional dampeners were failing one by one as he witnessed something that no mortal mind was meant to comprehend. The God Emperor of mankind was not simply dying. He was performing an act of conscious dissolution that would echo across the galaxy. In the Navigator House, Belisarius' spire, Navigatrix Octavia felt the Astronomican's death scream tear through her consciousness like a blade of pure agony. Her third eye, which had seen the Emperor's light guiding ships through the warp for 3 centuries, suddenly witnessed something else entirely. The moment when a god stopped pretending to be mortal. Blessed terror, she gasped, her hands pressed against her temples as blood ran freely from her psychic organ. Around her, the other navigators were experiencing the same terrible revelation. The light wasn't going out. It was transforming into something so bright, so fundamentally different, that their human minds couldn't process it. Navigator Prime Joia Belisarius burst into the chamber, just as Octavia collapsed, her consciousness overwhelmed by the psychic feedback. "What's happening?" he demanded, though part of him already knew. Every Navigator bloodline had legends about this moment, prophecies whispered in the deepest archives about the day when the Emperor's light would become something else. "He's dying," Octavia whispered, through lips flecked with blood. But not the way we thought. He's becoming something new, something we can't follow. Across Terra, every psychically sensitive human felt the moment when the Emperor's physical form finally surrendered its hold on life. It came not as a fading, but as an explosion of consciousness that had been compressed and contained for 10 millennia. The psychic shockwave spread outward from the Golden Throne chamber at the speed of thought, washing over the Imperial Palace like a tsunami of pure will. Sister Superior Thessaly was leading a group of evacuees through the palace's middle levels when the wave hit. Her null field flared and died as energies beyond the warp itself passed through her position. For a moment that lasted forever, every person in the evacuation column experienced perfect, absolute clarity, a glimpse of what the Emperor had seen, what he had planned, what he had sacrificed. Then the moment passed, and they were left with only the memory of having touched divinity. "He's gone," Thessaly whispered, though she wasn't sure how she knew. Her psychic null field was returning, but something fundamental had changed. The Emperor's presence, which had been a constant background warmth in the minds of the faithful for 100 centuries, was simply elsewhere. In the orbital defense platforms above Terra, Admiral Lansung watched through his command throne's viewports as something unprecedented occurred in the space around the Imperial Palace. A new star was being born, not in the void, but in the heart of Terra's atmosphere. Golden light erupted from the palace depths with such intensity that it briefly outshone Saul itself. "All stations," Lansung commanded, his voice steady despite what he was witnessing. "Full sensor sweeps. I want to know what we're looking at." The reports came back, fragmented and confused. Energy readings that made no sense according to any known physics. Gravitometric distortions that suggested local space-time was being rewritten. And underneath it all, a psychic signature so powerful that even the ship's non-psyker crew could feel it pressing against their minds like a physical weight. "Sir," his communications officer reported, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "We're receiving emergency broadcasts from everywhere. The Astronomicon is gone, sir. Every navigator house, every astropathic choir, they're all reporting the same thing. The Emperor's light has died." But even as she spoke, Lan Sung could see that wasn't entirely true. The golden radiance pouring from the palace was visible not just to the naked eye, but to every sensor array in the system. Whatever was happening down there was more than the death of a man. It was the birth of something else entirely. In the depths of space beyond Pluto's orbit, the beast felt the psychic shockwave wash over his flagship like the breath of a dying star. His massive orc brain, evolved for war and conquest, processed the sensation with surprising clarity. The Humi god Emperor was dead. The golden light that had guided the enemy's ships for 10,000 years was gone. This should have been the moment of ultimate triumph. The greatest enemy of the orc race had finally fallen, leaving the galaxy ripe for conquest. But the beast found himself troubled by something he couldn't quite identify. The psychic signature emanating from Terra wasn't fading. It was changing, becoming something that even his primitive understanding of the warp recognized as dangerous. Boss, his lieutenant, a scarred knob whose skull bore the ritual scars of a dozen Whoa-las, approached cautiously. "The Humi light thing is gone, but something new is coming," the beast finished, his voice a rumble that shook the bridge of his attack moon. "Something that ain't gonna be as easy to crump." On Terra, in the depths of the Golden Throne chamber, the physical form that had once housed the Emperor of mankind underwent its final transformation. Tech Adept Vex Mortis, still serving as an unwilling conduit for his master's consciousness, spoke words that would echo through history. "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," the Emperor's voice said through Vex Mortis's augmented throat. "But from this death, let there be rebirth. From this ending, let there be a new beginning." The Golden Throne itself began to phase in and out of real space, its ancient mechanisms struggling to contain energies that transcended the physical universe. The chamber walls, carved from living rock 10,000 years ago, started to show their true nature, not stone, but crystallized psychic energy that had been held in stasis by the Emperor's will. Fabricator General Kane watched in awe as reality itself began to unravel around the throne. He could see through the walls now, perceive the vast network of webway tunnels that honeycombed the space beneath the palace. More disturbing, he could see the things that moved in those tunnels, entities that had been waiting for this moment since the breach first opened during the heresy. "The barriers are failing," he transmitted to anyone who might still be listening. "All psychic containment is lost. The palace is becoming a warp nexus." Across the galaxy, every human psyker felt the Emperor's death as a physical blow. On distant worlds, astropaths collapsed at their stations, their enhanced minds suddenly flooded with visions of a golden figure rising from a throne of ancient technology. Some saw him as a warrior king wreathed in flame. Others perceived a being of pure light, transcending physical form. All of them understood, on a level deeper than conscious thought, that something fundamental about the universe had just changed. On the agri-world of Verdania, Astropath Prime Kessler felt the death scream pass through him like lightning. For a moment, his consciousness was pulled into the psychic maelstrom erupting from terror, and he saw the truth that would haunt him for the rest of his short life. The Emperor had not died by accident or circumstance. This had been planned, orchestrated. The Golden Throne's failure was not a tragedy, but a transformation that had been 10,000 years in the making. "He's not gone," Kessler whispered to his assistant, a young woman whose psychic sensitivity was just beginning to manifest. "He's just somewhere else now. Somewhere we can't follow. Yet." In the Imperial Palace, the evacuation had become a rout as reality itself proved unreliable. Corridors that had led to safety now opened onto vistas of impossible geometry. Stairwells descended into spaces that existed only in the warp. The distinction between the material universe and the realm of chaos was breaking down, and the palace was becoming something that existed in both simultaneously. Lord Commander Udo found himself leading a column of refugees through a section of the palace that he was certain hadn't existed an hour ago. The walls were lined with images that moved independently of any light source, frescoes depicting the Emperor's life, but showing events that no historical record contained. In some, he appeared as a simple man working in ancient laboratories. In others, he was a shining god commanding armies of light against creatures of living darkness. "My lord," one of his sergeants called out, pointing to a window that should have shown Terra's sky. Instead, it revealed a vista of golden light that stretched to the horizon, as if the entire planet was being illuminated from within. Through the chaos, emergency broadcasts continued to pulse across Terra's communication networks. "This is High Command," came the tinny voice through damaged Vox units. "The God Emperor protects no more. Repeat, the Emperor protects no more. All Imperial forces are to maintain positions and await further orders." But even as the official word spread, a different kind of communication was beginning. Those with the strongest faith, the deepest connection to the Imperial cult, were starting to report visions. Dreams of golden light, whispered words of comfort in moments of despair. It was as if the Emperor's death had not ended his presence, but freed it to manifest in ways that the Golden Throne had never allowed. In the former site of the throne chamber, Fabricator General Kane witnessed the final transformation. The Emperor's physical form dissolved into pure energy, releasing 10 millennia of accumulated psychic power in a single, reality-shattering moment. The explosion was visible to the naked eye from orbit, a second sun burning in Terra's heart, bright enough to be seen across the Sol system. But more than light was released in that moment. The faith of billions, the prayers of 100 billion souls across 1 million worlds, the accumulated devotion of 10,000 years, all of it was given form and purpose by the Emperor's conscious will. As his mortal shell died, something far greater was born. The golden radiance that erupted from the palace depths carried with it a message that every human in the galaxy felt in their bones. The Emperor was dead. Long live the Emperor! And in the depths of the warp, 4 ancient beings who had ruled unchallenged for eons felt something they had not experienced since their own births: fear. Chapter 4. Galaxy in Darkness. Captain Zerion Valus felt his ship die around him, as the warp storm that had been the righteous fury finally surrendered to the madness consuming it. He had been 3 days out from Cadia when the Astronomicon went dark, leaving his battlecruiser blind in the roiling chaos of the Immaterium. That had been... how long ago? Time meant nothing in the warp. It could have been hours or centuries. The Geller field had failed first. Not catastrophically. If it had, they would all have been demon spawn by now. Instead, it had failed slowly, letting the warp's influence seep into the ship's corridors like poison gas. His crew had begun changing within hours. First the younger ratings, their minds still flexible enough to be reshaped by forces beyond human comprehension. Then the older hands, their faith proving no defense against the raw stuff of chaos. "Captain," his navigator's voice came through the vox, distorted by something that might have been static or might have been screaming. I can see the way home, but it's not what it was." Vaelis looked out through the bridge's armored viewports at the hellscape that had claimed his vessel. Where there should have been empty space, writhing tentacles of living darkness caressed the ship's hull. His crew moved through the corridors below like sleepwalkers, their eyes reflecting lights that had no source in the material universe. Some had grown additional limbs overnight. Others had stopped speaking entirely, communicating only through sounds that made his teeth ache. "Plot a course," he commanded, knowing that it was already too late. The righteous fury would return to real space eventually. All ships did, if they were lucky. But what emerged would no longer serve the emperor of mankind. 7,000 light-years away, on the cardinal world of Ophelia 7, Ecclesiarch Deakis 9 received the astropathic reports with a mixture of horror and opportunity. The god-emperor was dead. That much seemed certain, though the competing accounts varied wildly in their details. Some claimed he had ascended to join the pantheon of ancient gods. Others insisted he had been murdered by traitors within the palace itself. "Your Holiness," Cardinal Vex approached cautiously, his ceremonial robes rustling in the cathedral's vast spaces. "The pilgrims are demanding answers. They're saying that if the Emperor is truly dead, then our teachings have been lies." Desus turned from the great window that looked out over Ophelia's sprawling shrine cities. Millions of pilgrims had come here, seeking divine guidance, drawn by the world's reputation for miraculous phenomena. Now they were trapped, cut off from their home worlds by the Astronomican's death, and their faith was curdling into something dangerous. "Then we give them a new truth," Deasis said quietly. "The God-Emperor has not died. He has transcended physical existence to wage war against the enemies of mankind in their own realm. Our prayers have always reached him. Now they shall sustain him in his new crusade." It was a desperate lie, but Deasis could see no alternative. Without faith, these millions would descend into anarchy within days. Better to reshape their beliefs than watch civilization collapse around his ears. On the forge world of Lucius, Fabricator General Kelbor Hall's successor found himself facing a crisis that no amount of sacred knowledge could solve. The Omnissiah was dead, and with him, the technological miracles that had sustained the Imperium for 10 millennia were beginning to fail. STC patterns that had functioned perfectly for generations were producing flawed results. Machine spirits that had served faithfully were becoming erratic, some developing what could only be described as independent will. The sacred formulas are changing, Tech Dominus Kell reported through binary cant, his mechanical voice carrying overtones of barely suppressed panic. Manufacturing yields are down 30% across all production lines. Some of the cogitators are speaking to us in languages that predate the Mechanicum. The Fabricator General processed this information with the cold logic of a machine, but underneath his augmented calm, something very human was beginning to fear. If the Omnissiah was truly gone, then perhaps the machines that served him would serve others. Or worse, perhaps they would serve themselves. In the maelstrom, Huron Blackheart felt the change in the warp's currents like a physical blow. The tyrant of Badab had carved out his domain through cunning and ruthless ambition, but he had always known his limits. The Emperor's presence had been a constant pressure, a force that kept the galaxy's darker powers in check. Now that pressure was gone, and things were stirring in the deep warp that had slumbered since the galaxy's youth, my lord, his champion, Garion, approached with visible caution. Even among the Chaos Marines, there were protocols to observe when dealing with a master psyker in the grip of visions. The demon princes are gathering. They sense opportunity. Blackheart opened eyes that blazed with stolen power and smiled with teeth that had never been entirely human. Then let them come. The Imperium's golden age is ending, and we shall feast on its corpse. On the distant world of Ultramar, Chapter Master Augustin of the Ultramarines received the fragmentary reports with the stoic calm that his gene father, Robout Guilliman, had exemplified. The Emperor was dead. The Astronomicon was gone. The Imperium was fragmenting into 1,000,000 isolated worlds, each one fighting for survival against odds that would have seemed impossible only days before. "Summon the captains," he commanded his equerry. "If we cannot maintain contact with Terra, then we must prepare to govern ourselves. Guilliman's writings speak of such contingencies. We have protocols to follow." It was what Ultramarines did in the face of impossible odds. They followed doctrine, adapted to circumstances, and pressed forward with methodical determination. Other chapters might despair or rage against fate. The Sons of Ultramar would simply do their duty, as they always had. But even Augustin could not entirely suppress the chill that ran down his spine as he contemplated a galaxy without the Emperor's light to guide it. In the depths of space beyond the galaxy's edge, Hive Fleet Behemoth's synapse creatures felt the psychic shockwave from Terra wash over them like the scent of wounded prey. The great feast world that the hive mind had been approaching for millennia had suddenly become something else, a source of psychic energy so intense that it was visible across the void between galaxies. The swarm changed course. Billions of bioships that had been following the galaxy's spiral arms toward the densest concentrations of biomass now turned toward a single point of light. The death of the Emperor had not diminished the psychic potential of humanity. It had concentrated it, focused it into a beacon that called to the Tyranids with irresistible hunger. On the tomb world of Mandragora, Necron Overlord Anrakir the Traveler felt his consciousness stirring after 60 million years of slumber. The psychic resonance that had awakened him was alien, organic, disturbingly vital. But it carried with it the promise of war on a scale not seen since the war in heaven itself. "My lord," his royal cryptek transmitted through the necrodermis link, "the monitoring stations detect massive shifts in galactic psychic potential. The young races appear to be undergoing some form of crisis." Anrakir's optical sensors blazed to life as his consciousness fully engaged with the present. Across the galaxy, similar scenes were playing out on 1,000 tomb worlds. The Great Sleep was ending, not in the measured awakening that the Silent King had planned, but in response to an opportunity that might not come again for eons. "Begin the awakening protocols," he commanded. "If the young races wish to tear themselves apart, we shall be there to claim what remains." On the cardinal world of Hagia, Canoness Superior Sabrina felt her faith waver for the first time in 3 centuries of service. She had led the Sisters of Battle through campaigns that would have broken lesser warriors, sustained by an unshakable belief in the God Emperor's protection. Now that protection was gone, and she found herself leading an army of warrior nuns who were beginning to ask questions that had no good answers. "The miracle of St. Silvana has ceased," Sister Dialogus Cassia reported, her voice carefully neutral. "The sacred flames that have burned for 1,000 years without fuel have gone out. The pilgrims are saying it's a sign that the Emperor has abandoned us." Sabrina looked out over Hagia's cathedral cities, where millions of the faithful maintained their vigils despite mounting evidence that their prayers were no longer being heard. She had always known that faith without works was meaningless, but she was beginning to understand that works without faith might be impossible. "Then we must become the miracles," she said finally. "If the Emperor can no longer protect them, then we must do so in his name." In the Segmentum Solar, rogue trader Thalassa Syndulla watched her family's trading empire transform overnight from a commercial enterprise into a military operation. With the Astronomicon gone and warp travel reduced to a deadly gamble, the established trade routes that had enriched her dynasty for millennia were useless. But chaos brought opportunity for those bold enough to seize it. "The Cygnus route is closed," her navigator reported from the bridge of the Prophet's Edge. "Pirates from the Calyx Expanse are moving to claim the junction worlds. If we're going to maintain control of our territories, we need to move fast." Thalassa nodded, her mind already calculating the resources needed to transform her merchant fleet into a war armada. The Imperium was dying, but from its corpse, new kingdoms would rise. She intended to claim her share. On 100,000 worlds, similar scenes played out as the reality of the Emperor's death began to sink in. Some planets declared independence, their governors seizing the opportunity to throw off Terra's yoke. Others descended into civil war as competing factions claimed divine mandate to rule in the Emperor's name. A few maintained order through martial law and the iron discipline of their planetary defense forces. But across the galaxy, one truth was becoming increasingly clear. The Imperium of Man, as it had existed for 10,000 years, was ending. What would replace it remained to be seen, but it would be built from the scattered remnants of the greatest civilization humanity had ever known. In the warp itself, the four Chaos gods felt the shift in the galaxy's psychic landscape with something approaching concern. For 10 millennia, the Emperor's presence had limited their influence, forcing them to work through mortal agents and corrupted champions. His death should have been the moment of their ultimate triumph. Instead, they found themselves facing something new and potentially more dangerous than the dying god they had battled for so long. The psychic energy released by the Emperor's death was not dissipating as they had expected. It was coalescing, taking shape, becoming something that felt disturbingly familiar. Another god was being born, forged from 10,000 years of human faith and sacrifice. And unlike the Chaos gods, who fed on base emotion and primal desire, this new deity would be sustained by humanity's highest aspirations. For the first time since their own births, the ruinous powers faced the prospect of a fair fight. And across the galaxy, in the darkness between the stars, something golden began to stir. Chapter 5. The War of Terra's Heart. The first orbital bombardment began at dawn over the Imperial Palace, though dawn and dusk had lost their meaning when the sky itself had turned the color of old blood. General Corton Race watched through the command bunker's armored viewport as the Orc-attack moons opened fire with weapons that made the palace's defense batteries look like ceremonial cannons. The bombardment wasn't aimed at military targets. The greenskins were past caring about strategic objectives. They were simply trying to crack Terra open like an egg, to dig down to whatever had caused the golden explosion that now served as a second sun in the planet's sky. Each impact sent shockwaves through the Earth that could be felt from pole to pole. "Sir," his aide, a young lieutenant whose face had aged a decade in the past 3 days, approached with the latest casualty reports. "The 127th Mordian is requesting permission to fall back to the secondary defensive line. They've lost contact with 3 of their companies, and the survivors are reporting impossible things." Race didn't ask for clarification. He'd seen the impossible things himself when the demons had first begun pouring out of the palace depths. His men, good soldiers who had served the Emperor faithfully for decades, were faced with enemies that violated every tactical principle they'd ever learned. How do you establish a firing line against creatures that can walk through walls? How do you call in artillery support against entities that exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously? Granted, he said, knowing that it wouldn't matter in the long run. The secondary defensive line was already compromised, along with the tertiary and quaternary positions. They were fighting a delaying action against forces that couldn't be delayed, buying time for an evacuation that might not be possible. 3 kilometers away, in the ruins of what had once been the Cathedral of the Savior Emperor, Chapter Master Vorthak of the Black Templars led his battle brothers in a desperate holding action against demon legions that seemed to spawn new horrors with every passing hour. His power sword carved through entities of living shadow and crystallized malice, its blessed blade one of the few things on Terra that could permanently banish the creatures back to their infernal realm. "Brother Captain Mordred," he voxed to his second-in-command, who was leading a squad of assault marines against a particularly massive demon that seemed to be made of screaming faces. "Status report." "The cathedral is lost, my lord." Mordred's voice came through the comm, crackling with interference that might have been psychic static or actual screams. "The demons are manifesting faster than we can banish them. Recommend we fall back to the Administratum complex and make our stand there." Vorthak parried a blow from something that had too many arms and eyes in places where eyes should never be. "Negative. We hold here until the evacuation is complete. The Emperor's children will not flee while his palace burns." It was a sentiment that would have been noble under normal circumstances. In the current situation, it was simple suicide. But Vorthak had sworn oaths that bound him tighter than adamantium chains, and he would keep them even if it meant his chapter died to the last man. In the deep hab blocks beneath the palace, Adept Mechanicus Korth 9 watched his fellow tech priests argue with a passion that their emotional dampeners should have made impossible. Half of them insisted that the Golden Throne could still be repaired, that the Emperor's death was merely a temporary setback, that proper application of sacred ritual could reverse. The other half had accepted the unthinkable truth and were focused on salvaging what they could from the wreckage of their faith. "The Omnissiah's will is clear," Magos biologist Vreen declared through his vox grill, his mechadendrite tendrils writhing with agitation. "We must preserve the sacred knowledge. The throne is lost, but the quest for knowledge continues." "Heresy!" Tech Dominus Grost's optical array blazed with fury as he rounded on his colleague. "The Omnissiah is not dead. His consciousness has merely been transferred to a higher plane of existence. We must restore the physical matrix and call him back." Korth 9 listened to the debate with growing despair. Above them, the sound of orc artillery was growing closer, and the demon incursions were spreading through the lower levels like a plague. Soon they would be forced to choose between fleeing to the surface and facing the war zone Terra had become, or staying underground and waiting for the demons to find them. Neither option offered much hope for survival. On the surface, in what had once been the Boulevard of Saints, Canoness Superior Sabrina led her Sisters of Battle in a running firefight against orc forces that had managed to land via drop pods launched from the orbiting attack moons. The greenskins were larger than any she had ever encountered, some towering over even space marines in their hulking bulk, and they fought with a savage intelligence that spoke of leadership beyond mere war energy. "Sisters!" she called out, as her squad took cover behind the rubble of a shrine that had stood for 3,000 years. "Remember why we fight. Not for the Emperor's glory, for that is eternal. We fight so that his children might live to see another dawn." Her bolter spoke with the voice of righteous fury, each shot finding its mark in green flesh and crude armor plating. But for every orc that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place. The drop pods kept coming, disgorging endless waves of savage aliens who cared nothing for casualties or tactical doctrine. They simply wanted to fight, and Terra had become the greatest battlefield the galaxy had ever seen. Sister Cassia, fighting at her canoness's side, paused to reload her weapon and caught sight of something that made her blood freeze. Through the smoke and chaos of the battlefield, she could see shapes that were definitely not orc or demon. They moved with the disciplined precision of space marines, but their armor bore the 8-pointed star of chaos. "Canoness," she voxed urgently. "We have traitor marines moving up from the southeast. Looks like a full company, maybe more." Sabrina felt her heart sink even further. The war for Terra wasn't just between loyalists and Xenos, or between humanity and demons. It had become a 3-way slaughter that would consume everything she had ever fought to protect. Deep in the webway tunnels beneath the palace, something vast and terrible stirred in the darkness. The beast himself had grown tired of watching the battle from orbit. The explosion of golden light that had marked the Humi God Emperor's death was calling to him, promising the greatest fight of his existence. He had come to Terra not to conquer it, but to test himself against whatever had replaced the dead deity. His teleportation was less a matter of technology than pure force of will, backed by war, energy on a scale not seen since the War of the Beasts' beginning. Reality simply bent around his desire to be elsewhere, depositing 15 feet of armored muscle and barely contained violence in the heart of the demon-infested tunnels. The demons that rushed to attack him learned quickly why the beast was the greatest orc the galaxy had ever produced. His power claw, a mechanical monstrosity the size of a Land Raider's turret, swept through ranks of lesser demon spawn like they were made of mist. His roar of challenge echoed through dimensions that mortal minds couldn't comprehend, a sound that made both loyalists and traitors pause in their fighting to look toward the palace depths. "Where is it?" the beast bellowed, in a voice that shook the foundations of reality itself. "Where is the new god that thinks it can replace the old one? Come and fight me." On Terra's orbital platforms, Admiral Lansung watched the planet die through displays that showed energy readings beyond anything in the Imperial Navy's experience. The golden radiance that had erupted from the palace was interacting with the warp breaches in ways that his tech adepts insisted violated the fundamental laws of physics. Parts of Terra's surface were simply disappearing, replaced by landscapes that belonged to no material universe. "Sir," his communications officer reported, with barely controlled hysteria, "we're receiving transmissions from ground forces, but some of them are coming from locations that don't exist on any map of Terra. Others are arriving before they're being sent." Lansung stared at the tactical displays that showed a planet in the grip of forces beyond human comprehension. Orc attack moons bombarded positions that phased in and out of real space. Demon legions fought running battles against Space Marine forces across battlefields where gravity flowed upward and time moved in circles. And underneath it all, something golden and terrible was growing stronger with each passing hour. "Begin evacuation of all orbital assets," he commanded, knowing that he was abandoning Terra to its fate. "Any ship that can achieve translation is to make for the nearest Imperial world and spread word of what has happened here." It was the hardest order he had ever given, but the alternative was watching his fleet consumed by the same madness that was devouring the throne world. In the depths of the palace archives, Inquisitor Vex Koteas, though he would not claim that title for centuries yet, watched the last of the sacred records burn as demon fire consumed the accumulated knowledge of 10 millennia. He was young for an Inquisitor, barely past his first century, but the crisis had forced rapid promotions throughout what remained of the imperial hierarchy. "The Lexicon Hereticus is gone," his aide reported, her voice empty of emotion. "The demon corruption has reached the deep vaults. Everything we know about fighting chaos is being consumed." Kotas nodded grimly as he activated the final purification charges that would deny the remaining archives to the enemy. 10,000 years of accumulated wisdom about combating the forces of darkness was about to be lost forever, leaving humanity to face the galaxy's horrors with nothing but their courage and whatever weapons they could forge from the wreckage. "Then we'll have to learn all over again," he said simply. "The Emperor may be dead, but his Inquisition endures." Above them all, in the ruins of the Golden Throne Chamber, something new was taking shape. The psychic energies released by the Emperor's death were not dissipating as they should have. Instead, they were coalescing, gaining focus and purpose with each passing moment. The faith of billions, the prayers of 1,000,000,000,000 souls, the accumulated devotion of 10,000 years, all of it was becoming something that had never existed before. A god born not of base emotion or primal hunger, but of humanity's highest aspirations. The war for terror raged on, but those with the sensitivity to perceive such things could feel a new presence stirring in the ruins of the old. The Emperor was dead, but something far greater was beginning to wake. And when it did, the galaxy would never be the same. In the meantime, Terra burned, and her children died in their billions, sacrifices on the altar of a transformation that none of them truly understood. The greatest battle in human history was being fought, not for territory or resources, but for the very soul of the species. And in the darkness between the stars, ancient intelligences that had slumbered since the galaxy's youth began to stir, drawn by the scent of change and the promise of war, on a scale not seen since the dawn of time. Chapter 6. Primarch's Return. The ship that broke through Terra's burning atmosphere bore no resemblance to any imperial design in active service. It was ancient beyond measure, its hull scarred by battles that predated the Imperium itself, and when it landed in the ruins of the palace's primary spaceport, every space marine within 50 kilometers felt something stir in their gene seed, a recognition that went deeper than conscious thought. Captain Tushan of the Salamander's Third Company was the first to see the figure that emerged from the craft's smoking wreckage. Even through the chaos of the ongoing battle, orc artillery shells screaming overhead, demon howls echoing from the palace depths, he knew immediately who stood before him. The massive frame, the storm-dark skin, the eyes that burned with inner fire. After decades of believing their Primarch lost forever, Vulcan had returned. "My lord." Tushan fell to one knee, his voice carrying across the Vox network to every salamander still fighting on Terra's surface. "The fires of Nocturne guide you home." Vulcan looked out over the hellscape that had once been the greatest city in human space, and something fundamental shifted in his expression. When he had last seen Terra, it had been during the heresy, wounded, but still recognizably the crown jewel of humanity's empire. Now it was a charnel house where his father's children died in their billions, while aliens and demons carved up the corpse of civilization. "Rise, my son." Vulcan's voice carried the weight of geological ages, the sound of mountains being born and stars going out. "There is work to be done, and the dead have no need of our reverence." Within hours, the word had spread through every imperial force still fighting on Terra's surface. The Primarch had returned. Vulcan, the Lord of Drakes, he who stands, was leading the defense of Terra in the Emperor's absence. For the first time since the Golden Throne had failed, there was something resembling hope among the scattered defenders. Chapter Master Vorthak received the summons while leading a fighting withdrawal through the ruins of the Cathedral District. His Black Templars had been holding their ground for 72 hours straight, their bolter ammunition long exhausted, fighting with chainsword and combat knife against demons that reformed faster than they could be destroyed. When the message came through, all Space Marine forces rally to the Palace spaceport. The Primarch commands it. He felt something inside his chest that he had almost forgotten was possible. You heard the order, he voxed to his surviving battle brothers. Fighting withdrawal to the rally point, the Primarch has returned to lead us. The retreat itself was a masterpiece of tactical coordination that spoke to the supernatural authority that Primarchs held over their sons. Space Marine forces that had been scattered across a continent-sized battlefield began moving with purpose for the first time in days. Salamanders, Black Templars, Imperial Fists, even scattered companies from chapters whose names would be forgotten before the current crisis ended, all of them felt the pull of their genetic heritage and answered the call. But it was the Imperial Guard regiments that truly understood what Vulcan's return meant. General Reyes, who had been preparing to make his final stand in a bunker complex that would last perhaps 6 more hours against the demon incursions, suddenly found himself receiving coherent orders from someone who seemed to understand the tactical situation better than he did himself. All Guard units are to begin immediate withdrawal to designated evacuation zones. The command came through channels that somehow cut through the psychic interference that had been crippling communications for days. Priority goes to civilian population. Military units will maintain defensive perimeters until transport capacity is reached. Ress stared at the tactical display that showed evacuation routes he hadn't even known existed. Ancient tunnel systems that predated the palace's construction, emergency bunkers that had been sealed since the dark age of technology. Someone with access to the deepest archives was coordinating this withdrawal, someone who understood Terra's infrastructure on a level that no living human should possess. Sir, his aide approached with an expression of barely controlled awe. We're receiving reports from across the continent. The evacuation is working. Somehow it's actually working. In the depths of the palace, where the webway breach had turned reality into a suggestion rather than a law, Vulcan walked paths that no mortal man could safely traverse. His perpetual nature, the curse and blessing that made him effectively immortal, allowed him to exist in spaces where the warp and real space overlapped without losing his sanity or his soul. The demons that had poured through the breach recognized him immediately. Not as a space marine or even as a Primarch, but as something far more dangerous, a being whose very existence was anathema to their nature. Where they were creatures of emotion and base desire, he was order given form. Where they represented chaos and destruction, he embodied the controlled fury of creation itself. You should not be here, son of the corpse god. A demon prince that had once been human spoke through a mouth filled with too many teeth. This realm belongs to us now. The barriers are broken, and your kind's time is ending. Vulcan's response was wordless. His war hammer, a weapon that had been ancient when the Imperium was young, spoke for him. The demon's destruction was so complete that even its screams were erased from existence, leaving only the memory of fire in the air where it had stood. But the creatures of chaos were not his true objective in the palace depths. Vulcan had come to see the place where his father had spent the last 10,000 years, to witness with his own eyes the truth that his superhuman mind still struggled to accept. The Golden Throne chamber was worse than anything he had imagined. The ancient machinery that had sustained the Emperor's failing form lay in ruins, its sacred mechanisms twisted into shapes that hurt to look at directly. But it was the throne itself that broke something inside Vulcan's heart. The massive construct of gold and archaeotech was empty, its life support systems dark and silent for the first time in 100 centuries. His father was dead. Not merely gone, not sleeping, not temporarily absent from his body. Dead in the most final and absolute sense of the word. The presence that had guided the Imperium through its darkest hours, that had been a constant warmth at the back of every loyal mind for 10,000 years, was simply absent. Vulcan had prepared himself for this moment ever since he had felt the Astronomicon die. But preparation meant nothing in the face of loss on this scale. He fell to his knees before the empty throne and wept tears that hissed against the chamber's corrupted floor, each droplet a small funeral pyre for the dreams of unity that had died with the Emperor of mankind. When he finally rose, his expression had changed. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it was tempered now by something harder and more dangerous: purpose. His father was dead, but his father's people still lived, and as long as they lived, the dream could survive in some form. "Forgive me, Father," he whispered to the empty air. "I cannot save your empire, but I can save your children." On the surface, the evacuation was proceeding with an efficiency that bordered on the miraculous. Civilian populations that had been trapped in the war zone for days were being shepherded to extraction points where ships waited, vessels that ranged from ancient cargo haulers to requisitioned passenger liners, anything that could achieve orbit and make the journey to the nearby systems that still maintained some semblance of imperial authority. Tech Adept Korth 9 watched the evacuation from a command post that had been set up in the ruins of the Administratum complex, his augmented mind struggling to process the logistics involved. By all calculations, they should have been overwhelmed by the sheer numbers, billions of people trying to evacuate through a limited number of spaceports, while 3 separate armies fought for control of the planet. But somehow, it was working. The Primarch had access to resources that no one else knew existed, and more importantly, he had the authority to make decisions that would have required committee meetings and bureaucratic approval under normal circumstances. When Vulcan said that a particular district was to be abandoned so that evacuation ships could use it as a landing zone, it happened. When he ordered that military units sacrifice themselves to buy time for civilian convoys, they did so without question or hesitation. Lord Vulcan's strategic acumen exceeds all projections, Korth 9 reported to his surviving superiors. Evacuation efficiency is at 847% of optimal theoretical rates. What he didn't report, because his logical processors couldn't quantify it, was the effect that the Primarch's presence was having on morale. Imperial Guard units that had been on the verge of breaking were holding their lines with renewed determination. Civilian populations that had been paralyzed by terror were moving with purpose toward the evacuation zones. Even the Space Marines, superhuman though they were, fought with a fury that exceeded their normal capabilities. It was, Korth 9's human intuition whispered, the effect of having a living demigod take personal command of their fate. In the webway tunnels beneath the palace, Vulcan's attempt to seal the breach was both the most desperate and most dangerous gambit of his long existence. His perpetual nature meant that he could survive exposure to raw warp energy longer than any other being, save perhaps the Emperor himself. But survival and success were 2 very different things. The breach itself was not simply a hole in reality, it was a wound in the fundamental structure of existence, held open by the accumulated malice of 10,000 years of demon manifestation. Closing it would require more than brute force or technical expertise. It would require a sacrifice of the kind that even Primarchs hesitated to contemplate. Vulcan placed his hands against the edges of the breach and felt the warp's power flow through him like molten metal through his veins. His perpetual nature began to burn away, layer by layer, as he used his own life force to weave new barriers where the Emperor's will had once held the chaos at bay. Each second aged him decades. Each minute cost him centuries of existence. But it was working. The demon flow was slowing, the reality distortions were stabilizing, and for a brief moment it seemed as if the breach might actually be contained. That was when the beast arrived. The Orc warlord's teleportation into the webway tunnel was less a matter of technology than sheer, bloody-minded determination. He had felt the change in the battlefield's energy patterns, sensed that someone new had taken command of the Humi forces, and his simple orc brain had reached the obvious conclusion. Here was a worthy opponent at last. "You!" The beast's roar echoed through dimensions that had no names, his massive form filling the tunnel from floor to ceiling. "You're the new boss, Humi! Finally! Someone worth fighting!" Vulcan turned from his work at the breach, and the beast saw something in the Primarch's eyes that made even his savage heart quicken with anticipation. Here was a warrior who understood what combat truly meant. Not mere violence, but the fundamental struggle between order and chaos that had raged since the universe's birth. "I am Vulcan," the Primarch said simply, his warhammer materializing in his grasp as if it had always been there. "And you are in my way." The beast's answering grin revealed tusks the size of chains wards and a hunger for violence that could have powered a small "Whoa!" on its own. "Good. Been looking for a proper fight ever since the Humi god thing exploded. You'll do." Behind them, the webway breach continued to pour forth demon legions, and above them, the evacuation of Terra continued with desperate urgency. But in this moment, in this place, the war for Terra had come down to something far simpler and far more ancient than strategy or logistics. Two beings who had been created for war were about to discover which of them was better at what they had been made to do. The future of humanity hung in the balance, and it would be decided by the outcome of a single combat between a Primarch who had lost everything and an alien warlord who had come to claim it all. Chapter 7. The New Warp God. In the immaterial realm where emotion took form and thought became substance, something unprecedented was taking place. The Emperor's death had released more than psychic energy. It had unleashed 10 millennia of accumulated faith, concentrated and purified by suffering beyond mortal comprehension. Where once there had been 4 powers ruling the warp's chaotic currents, now a 5th presence was coalescing from the golden light that had erupted from Terra's heart. Khorne felt it first, as befitted the oldest and most direct of the Chaos gods. The new presence tasted of fury, but fury tempered by justice, rage given purpose and direction rather than mindless violence. It was antithetical to everything the blood god represented, and when their essences touched in the deepest currents of the warp, Khorne recoiled, as if burned by holy fire. "What is this?" His voice shook the foundations of his brass citadel, sending demon legions fleeing in terror. "What dares to challenge the throne of skulls?" But even as he raged, Khorne understood what he was facing. Another god was being born, not from the base emotions that had given him and his brothers form, but from something far more dangerous: organized belief given divine purpose. For the first time since the war in heaven, the Lord of Battle felt something approaching fear. Tzeentch perceived the change as a disruption in the great web of possibility that was his domain. Millions of potential futures were suddenly shifting, realigning themselves around a new focal point that burned with the light of absolute certainty. The changer of ways, who had spent eons weaving plots within plots, found his carefully laid schemes unraveling before a will that refused to be influenced or corrupted. "Fascinating," he murmured through 1,000 mouths across 12 dimensions. "The dead god has become something else entirely. But what? What is this new player in the great game?" His answer came in the form of visions that forced their way into his consciousness, images of the Emperor as he had been during the Great Crusade, but transformed. Where once there had been a being who merely claimed divinity, now there stood something that had earned it through sacrifice beyond measure. The knowledge that 10,000 years of suffering had purified the Emperor's essence into something incorruptible sent ripples of unease through Tzeentch's labyrinthine domain. Nurgle felt the new presence as a cleansing fire that threatened everything he had built. His garden of diseases, lovingly cultivated across eons, began to wither as golden light swept through the warp's deepest recesses. Plagues that had festered since the galaxy's youth found themselves unable to take hold in spaces touched by the Emperor God's influence. "My beautiful children," he wept through pustulant eyes, watching as demons that had served him for millennia simply dissolved in the face of divine purity. "What has been done to you?" The god of decay understood, perhaps better than his brothers, what the Emperor's transformation meant. Death had not ended the master of mankind's existence. It had freed him from the limitations of mortality. Now he was something that Nurgle could never corrupt, never claim, never understand. A force of renewal that threatened the very concept of entropy itself. Slaaneish's reaction was the most visceral of all. The Prince of Pleasure had fed on excess and sensation since her violent birth. But the Emperor God's presence was like a void in the fabric of experience itself. Not the absence of emotion, but emotion so perfectly controlled and directed that it became something beyond the reach of chaos. When their essences briefly touched, Slaanesh felt her carefully crafted torments and ecstasies simply stop, nullified by a will that had transcended the need for base sensation. "Impossible," she hissed through lips that tasted of honey and poison. "Nothing is beyond the reach of desire. Nothing." But even as she spoke, Slaanesh could feel her influence waning in the spaces where the new god's presence grew strongest. The excess that sustained her was being replaced by something far more dangerous. Purpose without corruption, desire without depravity, perfection without flaw. On Terra, in the ruins of the webway tunnels, Vulcan felt the change as a sudden warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. He was locked in combat with the beast, their struggle shaking the foundations of the Imperial Palace, when the presence of his father, transformed but unmistakably familiar, washed over him like a benediction. "Father," he whispered, even as he parried a blow that would have shattered mountains. The beast noticed his distraction and pressed his attack, but Vulcan's attention was elsewhere. In the depths of the webway breach, something was happening that defied every law of physics he understood. The demons that had been pouring through the breach were screaming, not in rage or hunger, but in something approaching terror. Golden light was bleeding into the tunnels, and where it touched, the laws of the warp itself were being rewritten. Demon stuff dissolved back into base emotion, while the tunnel walls began to repair themselves with materials that belonged to no earthly forge. The beast felt it too, a pressure in his primitive mind that spoke of something vast and terrible awakening in the space between spaces. His savage intelligence, evolved for war and conquest, recognized the signs of a power that made even his war energy seem insignificant by comparison. "What's that?" he growled, his massive head turning toward the breach. "What's the Hume god thing doing down there?" Vulcan's answer came not in words, but in action. Drawing upon reserves of strength he hadn't known he possessed, the Primarch broke free from the beast's grappling hold and raised his war hammer high. But instead of striking his opponent, he brought it down upon the tunnel floor with enough force to crack the bedrock beneath Terra's surface. The impact triggered something that had been building since the moment of the Emperor's death. The webway breach, which had defied every attempt at closure for 10,000 years, suddenly began to seal itself. Not through technological intervention or psychic force, but through an act of divine will that rewrote the fundamental laws governing the space between real space and the warp. Across the galaxy, every psyker, with even the slightest sensitivity, felt the moment when the new god took his first conscious action. It came as a vision of golden light and righteous fury, a presence so vast and pure that many fell to their knees in involuntary worship. But unlike the mindless adoration that chaos demanded, this was something else. Recognition of divinity earned through sacrifice rather than claimed through force. On the shrine world of Ophelia 7, Ecclesiarch Deasis felt the transformation in his very bones. The cathedral around him, which had stood empty and cold since the Astronomicon failed, suddenly blazed with light that had no earthly source. The golden aquila above the altar began to glow with inner fire, and when he looked upon it, Deasis saw not the symbol of a dead god, but the face of divinity itself looking back at him. "He lives," he whispered, and then louder, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast cathedral. "He lives. The God Emperor has transcended death itself. He lives." The effect on the assembled pilgrims was immediate and profound. Millions of voices rose in spontaneous prayer, their faith given focus and purpose by the visible manifestation of divine presence. But these were not the desperate pleas of the abandoned. They were hymns of triumph, songs of victory over the forces of darkness and despair. Similar scenes played out across 1,000 worlds as the Emperor God's influence spread through the warp. On Cadia, fortress world of the Eye of Terror, the massive pylons that held chaos at bay began to resonate with new purpose. On Holy Terror itself, in the ruins of the Golden Throne Chamber, tech priests reported that the ancient machinery was responding to commands that no living human had given. Tech Adept Korth 9, monitoring the evacuation from his command post, watched in amazement as his instruments detected the impossible. The webway network, dormant since the heresy's end, was coming back online. Not just the tunnels beneath Terra, but the entire galaxy-spanning system of Eldar construction that the Emperor had sought to claim for humanity. "The network is self-repairing," he transmitted to anyone with the clearance to receive such information. "Sacred pathways sealed for 10 millennia are opening. The Omnissiah guides the network's revival." But even as he spoke, Korth 9 understood that the Omnissiah who now commanded the ancient technology was not the same being who had sat upon the Golden Throne. This was something greater, something that had been forged in the crucible of divine death and rebirth. In the deepest reaches of the warp, where the 4 Chaos Gods held their eternal courts, emergency councils convened for the first time since their births. The balance of power that had ruled the immaterial realm for eons was shifting, and they found themselves faced with something that none of their accumulated cunning had prepared them for. "He cannot be corrupted," Tzeentch reported to his brothers, his normally confident voice edged with uncertainty. "I have sent my greatest servants against his influence, offered him bargains that would tempt saints, and he simply ignores them. As if chaos itself is beneath his notice." "His light burns my garden," Nurgle added, his usual joviality replaced by genuine concern. where his presence touches, decay itself is healed. Order is restored not through force, but through an act of will so pure that entropy itself bends to his design. Khorne's contribution was characteristically direct. He cannot be fought. My greatest champions dissolve in his presence like snow before flame. This new god is built from everything we are not. Slaanesh said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. For a being whose existence depended on excess and corruption, the Emperor God's presence was like a void in the fabric of sensation itself. Not the absence of feeling, but feeling so perfectly controlled that it transcended the reach of chaos. On Terra, the war that had raged for days was beginning to shift as the Emperor God's influence made itself felt in the material realm. Orc forces that had fought with mindless savagery suddenly found themselves facing space marines, whose bolters spoke with divine authority. Demon legions that had seemed inexhaustible began to thin as their connection to the warp was severed by golden light. Most dramatically of all, the Chaos Space Marine warbands that had come to feast on Terra's corpse found the very air around the planet becoming hostile to their presence. Their power armor, blessed with the marks of the dark gods, began to malfunction as divine influence rewrote the fundamental laws governing chaos corruption. Warsmith Honso of the Iron Warriors felt his ancient armor seize up as golden light played across its surfaces. The demon engine that served as his transport's machine spirit screamed once and then fell silent, its corrupted essence unable to maintain coherence in the Emperor God's presence. "Retreat!" he commanded his remaining forces, though the word tasted like ash in his mouth. "All ships make for the system edge. Whatever's happening here, we want no part of it." The evacuation of Chaos forces from the Sol system was swift and panicked. Warbands that had spent 10,000 years serving the Dark Gods suddenly found themselves cut off from the source of their power, their demonic allies banished back to a warp that was no longer fully under Chaos control. But perhaps the most significant change was taking place among humanity's scattered populations. Across the galaxy, in the depths of hive cities, and the isolation of frontier worlds, ordinary humans began experiencing visions of golden light. Not the mad dreams that chaos sent to tempt and corrupt, but clear, purposeful communications from a divine presence that had transcended mortality. On the mining world of Krieg, Worker Designate 77 Alpha felt the vision like a warm hand upon her shoulder. She had labored in the underground tunnels for 30 years, her life circumscribed by duty and devotion to the Emperor. Now, as she knelt in the darkness of the deep shafts, she saw him as he truly was. Not the corpse god of imperial propaganda, but a being of pure light who had chosen to die so that humanity might live. "The Emperor protects," she whispered, and for the first time in her life, the words carried the weight of absolute truth. Similar scenes played out on 10,000 worlds as the Emperor God's influence spread through the galaxy. The faith that had sustained humanity through its darkest hours was being rewarded with actual divine presence. Not the distant authority of the Golden Throne, but immediate personal communion with a God who had earned his divinity through sacrifice beyond measure. The transformation was not without cost. In the depths of the warp, where the Emperor God's essence was still coalescing, the energies released by his apotheosis sent shockwaves through dimensions that mortal minds couldn't comprehend. Reality itself was being rewritten on a scale not seen since the birth of the first Chaos gods, and the consequences would echo through eternity. But for now, in this moment, humanity had something it had never possessed before, a god who was truly their own. not a distant authority demanding blind obedience, but a divine presence that had shared their suffering and chose to transform it into transcendence. The war for terror was far from over, but the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. The Emperor was dead. Long live the Emperor God. Chapter 8. The Siege of Sacred Terra. The beast felt the change in Terra's very bones as his massive form stood amid the ruins of what had once been the greatest city in human space. What he had come to conquer was no longer a world at all. It was becoming something else entirely. A place where the material universe and the realm of spirit overlapped in ways that made his primitive mind recoil with instinctive unease. The ground beneath his feet no longer obeyed the simple laws of physics that governed proper battlefields. Sections of the imperial palace phased in and out of reality, showing glimpses of golden halls that existed in no earthly dimension. The air itself tasted of power that had nothing to do with war, energy, something pure and focused that made his teeth ache and his crude augmetics spark with interference. "This ain't right," he growled to his lieutenant, a scarred knob, whose own confusion was visible in his beady red eyes. "This place ain't for crumpin' anymore. It's something else now." Above them, the sky had become a canvas of impossible colors, where the Emperor God's influence manifested as aurora that spoke in languages older than the galaxy itself. The Orc attack moons, positioned for the final bombardment that would crack Terra open like an egg, found their weapon systems malfunctioning as divine energy interfered with the crude but effective technology that powered them. In the depths of the webway tunnels, Vulcan felt his father's presence as a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with purpose. The Emperor God was not speaking to him. That would come later, in dreams and visions that would guide the salamanders for millennia to come. But his will was clear enough. Drive the invaders from Holy Terra, no matter the cost. All Imperial forces, Vulcan's voice carried across every Vox channel still functioning on the planet, his words somehow cutting through interference that had crippled communications for days. "This is your Primarch. The Emperor guides our weapons. The time for retreat has ended. We take back our father's world." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Imperial Guard units that had been falling back for days suddenly found themselves advancing with purpose that transcended mere military discipline. Space Marines from a dozen different chapters moved with coordinated precision that spoke to genetic programming older than conscious thought. Even the scattered PDF forces that had been reduced to guerrilla warfare emerged from their hiding places to join the advance. But it was the effect on the enemy forces that truly demonstrated the power of divine intervention. Demon legions that had seemed inexhaustible began to thin as the Emperor God's influence made itself felt in the material realm. The warp around Terra was becoming increasingly hostile to creatures of chaos, and maintaining coherent manifestation required energy that the demon princes could no longer spare. Greater Demon Drachnek, who had led the initial assault through the webway breach, felt his essence beginning to unravel as golden light played across his monstrous form. The faith and prayers of humanity, focused through their newly ascended god, were becoming a weapon more terrible than any bolter or chain sword. "This realm is lost to us," he spoke through a mouth filled with geometrically impossible teeth, his words carrying to every lesser demon still fighting on Terra's surface. "Withdraw to safer hunting grounds. Let the young races tear each other apart. We shall feast on what remains." The retreat of Chaos forces was swift and panicked. Demon legions that had carved through Imperial defenses like hot knives through butter found themselves dissolving under the weight of organized faith, given divine purpose. The webway breach itself was sealing as the Emperor God asserted control over the ancient Eldar network, cutting off the primary route by which reinforcements had been arriving. For the first time since the crisis began, the defenders of Terra faced only one enemy. On the bridge of the Phalanx, Admiral Lansung watched the tactical displays with a mixture of amazement and professional satisfaction as his severely depleted fleet found itself with actual targets to engage. The Orc attack moons, massive though they were, had been designed to operate in normal space. The reality distortions that now surrounded Terra were playing havoc with their guidance systems and power distribution networks. "All ships," he commanded, his voice steady, despite the impossible nature of what he was ordering. "Advance to weapons range. The Emperor protects, and his protection takes the form of warp storms that will shield our approach." It was tactically insane, deliberately flying a fleet into a reality storm that was rewriting the laws of physics on a moment-by-moment basis. But Lansung's navigator, who had felt the Emperor God's presence like a guiding star in the psychic darkness, assured him that their passage would be protected. Divine intervention was no longer a matter of faith. It had become observable, measurable reality. The space battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded Imperial history. Orc vessels found their weapons misfiring as golden energy played across their hulls, while Imperial ships moved through the warp disturbances as if guided by an intelligence that knew every current and eddy in the immaterial realm. It was not merely naval combat. It was a demonstration of the difference between divine favor and crude Xenos brutality. Attack Moon. Gork's Fist suffered a catastrophic reactor breach when its primary weapons tried to fire on the Imperial flagship Righteous Fury. The explosion was visible from Terra's surface, a new star blooming in the sky as several billion tons of Orc engineering were consumed by energies that belonged to no material universe. "Boss," the beast's lieutenant pointed toward the burning wreckage with one massive arm, his voice carrying a tremor that no Orc should have been capable of feeling. "Da ships is dyin'. Da war ain't working right. Something's wrong with the fight itself." The beast felt it too. The psychic energy that powered his armies was being disrupted by something that felt like the opposite of everything he understood about proper warfare. Where war? Energy was chaotic, brutal, and joyfully destructive. This new force was organized, purposeful, and implacably righteous. It was like trying to fight while standing in a river of liquid order. On Terra's surface, Captain Tushan led his salamanders in an assault that would be remembered in chapter lore for millennia to come. The Orcs they faced were no longer the savage, but effective warriors they had been days earlier. Their crude but functional weapons were misfiring, their coordination was breaking down, and their morale, such as it was, had been shattered by the death of several attack moons in rapid succession. "For the Emperor!" Tushan's battle cry echoed across the ruins of the cathedral district as his flamer spoke with tongues of blessed fire. "For Vulcan! For the glory of the 18th!" The salamanders advanced through opposition that crumbled before them like paper before a blowtorch. Each bolter shot found its mark with precision that transcended mere skill. Each chainsword cut through Orc flesh and armor with an ease that spoke to divine blessing rather than superior equipment. The Emperor God was not merely watching, he was actively participating in the battle for his sacred world. In the orbital platforms above Terra, Tech Adept Korth 9 watched his instruments detect the impossible as the planet's very nature continued to change. Sections of Terra's surface were simply disappearing from normal space, replaced by landscapes that registered as non-existent on every scanner array available to the Mechanicus. Other areas showed energy readings that violated the fundamental laws of thermodynamics. "The sacred world is undergoing apotheosis," he transmitted to the Fabricator General's successor, his augmented voice carrying overtones of awe that his emotional dampeners couldn't entirely suppress. The Emperor God is remaking it according to patterns that predate human understanding. It was, Korth 9's enhanced intellect realized, what had always been the ultimate goal of the imperial faith, not merely to worship a distant god, but to transform reality itself according to divine will. The Emperor's death hadn't ended his plan. It had finally allowed him to implement it without the constraints of mortality. The final assault on the beast's position came as the last attack. Moons were consumed by warp storms that seemed to specifically target Orc technology, while leaving Imperial vessels untouched. Vulcan led the advance personally, his warhammer blazing with fire that owed as much to divine inspiration as it did to plasma technology. The beast met his charge with the desperate fury of a warrior who understood that this was no longer a battle he could win. His power claw, a weapon that could have shattered tank armor, met Vulcan's hammer in a clash that sent shockwaves through dimensions that mortal minds couldn't perceive. But where the Orc warlord fought with brute force and animal cunning, the Primarch fought with the backing of a god who had transcended the limitations of physical existence. "You're not just fighting me," Vulcan spoke, as their weapons locked in a contest of strength that shattered the ground beneath their feet. "You're fighting 10,000 years of human faith, given form and purpose. You cannot win." The beast's answering roar was equal parts rage and despair as he felt his "Wee!" energy being systematically dismantled by forces that operated according to rules he couldn't comprehend. Around them, his surviving warriors were falling back in increasing disorder as the psychic network that bound Orc society together began to collapse under divine pressure. The beast's death came not as a single decisive blow, but as the inevitable result of fighting an opponent backed by powers beyond the material universe. Vulcan's hammer, wreathed in flames that belonged to no earthly forge, shattered the Orc warlord's primitive but effective power armor and found the flesh beneath. The beast fell with a crash that was felt across the Sol system, and with his death, the war that had brought the Imperium to its knees simply ended. Across Terra and the surrounding space, Orc forces found themselves suddenly and catastrophically alone. The psychic bond that had united them in common purpose was severed, leaving millions of individual greenskins with no higher goal than personal survival. Some turned on each other in confused fury. Others simply wandered away from the battlefield, their primitive minds unable to process the death of their ultimate leader. Most simply stood motionless until Imperial forces arrived to finish them. Within hours, organized Orc resistance had ceased to exist. The greatest war since the time of Ulanor was reduced to scattered bands of confused aliens who posed no greater threat than any other Xenos infestation. The War of the Beast was over, but the cost of victory had been everything the Imperium had been before. As the guns fell silent and the evacuation fleets prepared to depart Terra's orbit, those few with the sensitivity to perceive such things could feel the planet's transformation continuing. The Emperor God's influence was remaking his sacred world according to patterns that would serve as a template for the new age to come. Where once there had been a corpse god clinging to failing life, now there was a divine presence actively shaping reality according to his will. Terra would survive, but it would never again be the world that had given birth to humanity's greatest dreams. It was becoming something else, a focal point where the material universe and the realm of spirit intersected, a place where the faithful could literally walk with their God. The siege of sacred Terra was ended. But the true war for humanity's soul was just beginning. In the depths of space, fleeing Orc vessels carried word of their defeat to the scattered wars that still plagued the galaxy. But the news they brought was not of tactical failure or superior human technology. They spoke of something far more terrifying, a species that had learned to make their gods real, and the implications of that transformation for every other race in the galaxy. The age of the corpse god was over. The age of the Emperor Ascendant had begun. Chapter 9. Imperium Divided. 6 months after the beast's death and Terra's transformation, Chapter Master Augustin of the Ultramarines stood in the same chamber where Robert Guilliman had once declared the formation of Imperium Secundus during the dark days of the heresy. The parallels were unmistakable, though the circumstances had changed in ways that even the Primarch's strategic genius might not have anticipated. The situation is clear. Augustin addressed the assembled representatives of the 500 worlds of Ultramar, his voice carrying the weight of necessity rather than ambition. Terra has become something beyond our understanding. The High Lords are scattered or dead. The Administratum exists only in fragments. If we do not act, 1 billion souls will die from simple lack of coordination. The council chamber buzzed with quiet conversation as planetary governors, space marine captains, and Adeptus Mechanicus representatives processed what their chapter master was proposing. It was not rebellion. The Ultramarines' loyalty to the Emperor was beyond question, but it was something perhaps more significant. The acknowledgement that the Imperium, as it had existed for 10,000 years, was gone forever. Tetrarch Felix Cassius, veteran of a dozen campaigns and voice of the chapter's pragmatic wing, spoke first. The Codex Astartes provides protocols for this situation. When central authority fails, regional commands must assume responsibility for local populations. Guilliman foresaw this possibility. But did he foresee the Emperor's ascension to true divinity? The question came from Chaplain Varnus, whose faith had been both shattered and reforged by the golden visions that had swept through the Imperium in recent months. We are not merely dealing with political collapse. We face a fundamental transformation of humanity's relationship with the divine. The debate that followed would establish the template for countless similar discussions across the galaxy as imperial institutions grappled with their new reality. Some argued for strict adherence to pre-existing protocols, as if maintaining tradition could somehow restore the old order. Others insisted that the Emperor's apotheosis demanded entirely new approaches to governance and faith. 7,000 light-years away, on the strike cruiser Red Tear, Commander Dante of the Blood Angels received word that the Ultramarines had declared themselves an autonomous realm. His reaction was characteristic of his chapter's transformation in the months since Terra's crisis, acceptance tinged with melancholy, and a grim determination to do what needed to be done, regardless of political niceties. "We have no realm to declare autonomous," he told his assembled captains, as the ship's Vox operators struggled to maintain communication with the scattered elements of his chapter. "Our home is the void between stars. Our purpose, the protection of humanity wherever we find it threatened." The Blood Angels had taken their genetic father's sacrifice to heart in ways that went deeper than doctrine or tradition. Where other chapters were establishing kingdoms or joining confederations, the sons of Sanguinius had chosen a different path. They had become crusaders in the truest sense, warriors without fixed base or political allegiance, bound only by their oath to protect the Emperor's children wherever they might be found. "All companies will continue independent operations," Dante commanded, his voice carrying through the ship's internal Vox network to battle brothers who were scattered across half the galaxy. "Maintain contact where possible, but do not compromise mission effectiveness for the sake of unity. The Emperor protects through our actions, not our organization. It was a decision that would transform the Blood Angels and their successor chapters from a centralized military force into something resembling a knightly order, individual companies and even single squads operating according to their own interpretation of their duty to humanity. Some would become the defenders of single worlds, others would range across entire sectors in pursuit of threats that conventional forces couldn't handle. On the Forge world of Lucius, the theological split that had been brewing within the Adeptus Mechanicus since the Golden Throne's failure finally came to open schism. Tech Dominus Kell, who had spent months trying to understand how the Omnissiah's death had led to even greater manifestations of divine power, found himself facing a council of his peers who represented two irreconcilable interpretations of recent events. "The Omnissiah has transcended physical form," declared Magos biologist Vrain, his optical arrays blazing with fervor that his emotional dampeners couldn't entirely suppress. His consciousness now inhabits the machine networks directly. Every STC pattern that manifests, every tech spirit that awakens, these are proofs of his continued presence. "Heresy!" Tech Dominus Grost's response was immediate and vehement. The Omnissiah's physical form was sacred. Its destruction represents the greatest failure in the Mechanicus's history. We must work to restore what has been lost, not celebrate our failure as some kind of victory. The debate that raged through the Forge world's data networks was being repeated across every Mechanicus stronghold in the galaxy. The Orthodox faction insisted that the Emperor's death was a catastrophe to be remedied, while the Reformed faction saw it as a necessary transformation that had freed the Omnissiah from the limitations of flesh. Both sides claimed the support of ancient doctrine, and both could point to miraculous phenomena that seemed to validate their interpretation. The practical result was a schism that would reshape the Mechanicus for millennia to come. Forge worlds that accepted the Reformed doctrine began experimenting with technologies that would have been branded heretical just months earlier. Those that maintained orthodoxy retreated into increasingly rigid adherence to the most conservative interpretations of the sacred texts. In the vast commercial networks that connected human civilization across the galaxy, a different kind of transformation was taking place. Rogue trader dynasties, freed from the oversight of a centralized administratum, found themselves becoming the primary means by which isolated human worlds maintained contact with the broader community of mankind. Trader Captain Thalassa Syndulla, whose fleet had been operating out of the Coronis Expanse when the crisis began, discovered that her warrant of trade had become something far more valuable than a license to conduct business beyond imperial borders. It was now a mandate to serve as humanity's diplomatic and commercial backbone in a galaxy where traditional authority had collapsed. "The Severan route is closed," her navigator reported, as the Prophet's Edge translated back into real space at the edge of the Calyx Expanse. "The planetary governments are demanding tribute from any ship that wants passage. They're claiming authority under emergency protocols that don't actually exist." Syndulla considered the tactical display that showed her the new reality of interstellar commerce. Where once there had been standardized imperial trade routes protected by Navy patrols, now there were 1,000 local fiefdoms, each one demanding its own fees and imposing its own rules. It was chaos from an administrative perspective, but for a rogue trader with the resources and flexibility to adapt, it was also opportunity. "Signal the local authorities," she commanded. "Inform them that the Syndulla dynasty is prepared to negotiate transit rights, but only as part of a broader mutual defense agreement. They can join our trade network or watch their worlds slowly starve as commerce routes flow around them." It was a conversation that was being repeated throughout the galaxy as rogue trader dynasties transformed themselves from commercial enterprises into the diplomatic core of a fragmenting civilization. Their ships became the only reliable means of communication between distant star systems, their trade networks the foundation upon which new confederations and alliances would be built. The Ecclesiarchy's response to the crisis was perhaps the most complex and fractured of all. On Ophelia VII, Ecclesiarch Deachus found himself facing a theological revolution that made the Mechanicus schism look simple by comparison. The emperor's death and apparent apotheosis had shattered millennia of established doctrine, leaving the faithful without clear guidance about what they were supposed to believe. The reports from Dimamar speak of golden warriors appearing to defend the faithful from heretic raiders, Cardinal Vex reported during what had become a daily crisis briefing. On Mordia, the PDF claims that their lasguns fired with divine accuracy during the Orc incursion, and from a dozen worlds we receive accounts of miracles that exceed anything in our archives. Deachus studied the reports with the weariness of a man whose entire worldview had been turned inside out in the space of a few months. The Emperor's death should have been the end of the imperial faith. Instead, it seemed to have unleashed manifestations of divine power that made the old miracles look pale by comparison. "What do the theological councils recommend?" he asked, though he already knew that the answer would be more questions rather than clarity. "They can't reach consensus," Vex admitted. "Half insist that the Emperor's physical death proves he was never truly divine, that we've been worshipping a false god for 10,000 years. The others claim that his transcendence proves his divinity beyond any doubt. The reformist faction is calling for completely new liturgies based on direct communication with the ascended emperor." The theological chaos was being played out on every imperial world where the faith had taken hold. Some planetary ecclesiarchies declared independence from Terra's authority, claiming direct revelation from the emperor god that superseded any earthly hierarchy. Others retreated into orthodox fundamentalism, rejecting any doctrine that couldn't be traced back to pre-crisis sources. The practical result was a fragmentation of humanity's spiritual life that mirrored the political collapse of central authority. Where once there had been a unified imperial creed, now there were hundreds of local interpretations, each claiming to represent the true understanding of the emperor's will. On the death world of Krieg, planetary governor Jurgen faced a problem that was becoming common throughout the Imperium: how to maintain order and productivity when the institutional frameworks that had governed human civilization for 10 millennia no longer functioned. His solution was characteristically direct and typically Krieg. "The Imperial Guard regiments stationed here are hereby incorporated into the Planetary Defense Force," he announced to his assembled staff officers. "Their equipment, training, and personnel will be retained. But their mission is now the permanent defense of Krieg rather than deployment to external theaters." It was a decision that was being made on 10,000 worlds as planetary governments found themselves cut off from central authority and forced to provide for their own defense. The Imperial Guard, as a galaxy-spanning military force, was ceasing to exist. In its place, local armies were emerging that owed their loyalty to individual worlds or regional confederations rather than Terra. The transformation was not without its benefits. Regiments that had been raised on one world and deployed to fight on another for decades could finally return home, bringing with them experience and equipment that would transform local defense capabilities. But it also meant that the Imperium's ability to respond to galaxy-spanning threats was evaporating along with its central authority. In the halls of the fortress monastery of the Imperial Fists on Terra, Chapter Master Thane faced a decision that would define his chapter's future. The Fists had always been the Emperor's Praetorians, the defenders of Terra and the guardians of the imperial palace. But Terra was no longer the world they had sworn to protect, and the Emperor no longer required their physical protection. "The sacred duty remains," he told his assembled captains, his voice echoing through chambers that had been carved from living rock during the Great Crusade. "But the form of that duty must change. The Emperor protects through his divine will, but his children still require our protection." The Imperial Fists would remain on Terra, but their role was transforming from palace guards to something resembling a monastic order. They would maintain the sacred sites where the Emperor God's presence was strongest, serve as interpreters of his divine will, and coordinate the scattered efforts of other chapters that still acknowledged Terra's spiritual authority. Other chapters were making different choices. The Salamanders had scattered to the worlds of their recruitment sectors, establishing individual companies as protectors of specific human populations. The Iron Hands had withdrawn to their fortress monastery and declared their independence from all external authority, pursuing their own interpretation of the Emperor's will through technological perfection. Each choice reflected not just tactical considerations, but fundamental differences in how the chapters interpreted their role in a galaxy where the Emperor was no longer a distant authority figure, but an active divine presence whose will could be felt directly by those with sufficient faith. The result was a transformation of the Adeptus Astartes from a unified military force into something resembling the knightly orders of ancient Terra, independent brotherhoods bound by common purpose, but free to pursue their own interpretation of their sacred mission. As the months passed and the new order took shape, it became clear that the Imperium of Man, as it had existed for 10,000 years, was gone forever. In its place, a dozen different experiments in human governance were emerging, some based on regional confederations, others on ideological affiliations, still others on simple proximity and mutual need. The Ultramarines Imperium Secundus became the template for several similar regional governments that combined Space Marine leadership with civilian administration. The Blood Angels' crusade fleets inspired other chapters to abandon their fixed territories in favor of mobile protection of human populations wherever they might be found. Rogue trader dynasties evolved into the primary diplomatic network connecting these scattered human polities, while the Mechanicus Schism created competing technological traditions that would pursue different paths toward understanding the Omnissiah's will. Through it all, the Emperor God's presence provided a unifying spiritual foundation that prevented complete fragmentation. Humanity was dividing into multiple political entities, but they remained united in their recognition of the divine presence that had been born from their collective faith and the Emperor's ultimate sacrifice. The age of the unified Imperium was over. The age of humanity's divine destiny was just beginning. Chapter 10. The Emperor's Crusade. On the war-torn world of Mordian Prime, Captain Thaddeus Kryn of the 5th Mordian Iron Guard witnessed something that would redefine his understanding of faith and warfare. His regiment had been holding the line against a massive orc incursion for 7 days, their ammunition running low and their casualties mounting with each wave of green-skinned savages that crashed against their positions. It was in the moment when all seemed lost, when the final magazine was loaded and the last bayonet fixed, that the golden figures appeared. They came not as physical manifestations, but as something between light and substance, warriors clad in armor that blazed with inner fire and bore weapons that seemed forged from concentrated starlight. There were dozens of them, moving through the Mordian ranks like blessed spirits, their presence filling every guardsman with strength that transcended mere adrenaline. "Emperor, preserve us," Kryn whispered, as he watched one of the spectral warriors place a luminous hand on the shoulder of Private Voss, whose lasgun had been damaged beyond repair hours earlier. The weapon blazed with golden light for a moment, then began firing with accuracy that no mortal soldier could achieve. The Orc assault broke against the reinvigorated Imperial line like waves against an adamantium seawall. Lasguns that should have been empty continued to fire, their power cells somehow replenishing themselves with each shot. Wounded men rose from their stretchers with their injuries healed, their eyes blazing with divine purpose. Most remarkably of all, the Golden Warriors fought alongside them, their spectral blades cutting through Orc flesh with ease that defied every law of physics. When the battle was over, and the last Orc lay dead in the mud, the spectral warriors simply faded away, leaving behind only the memory of their presence and the unshakable knowledge that the God Emperor was no longer a distant figure on a golden throne, but an active participant in humanity's struggle for survival. 7,000 light-years away, on the shrine world of Dimmermar, something even more extraordinary was taking place. Sister Cassia, who had served in the Order of the Bloody Rose for 3 decades without experiencing anything approaching a miracle, found herself at the center of a transformation that defied every theological doctrine she had ever learned. It began with the dreams, visions of golden light that spoke to her, not in words but in pure understanding. The Emperor God was calling her to something greater than simple service, something that would require her to become a conduit for divine will in the material universe. When she awoke from the final vision, Cassia discovered that she was no longer entirely mortal. Her flesh had taken on a subtle luminescence that became more pronounced when she was moved to righteous anger. Her bolter fired shells that blazed with holy light, each shot guided by divine purpose rather than mere skill. Most remarkably of all, her presence seemed to banish the very concept of despair from those around her, filling even the most hopeless situations with renewed faith and determination. "Sister," Canoness Superior Sabrina approached her with a mixture of awe and concern. "The ecclesiarchy will want to examine you. Living saints are not simply declared. They must be confirmed through proper theological review." Cassia turned to her superior with eyes that held depths of understanding that had not been there days before. "With respect, Canoness, I think the old ways of doing things may no longer apply. The Emperor God calls his chosen directly now. The ecclesiarchy can confirm what he has already decided, but they cannot unmake what divine will has wrought." It was a conversation that was being repeated across the galaxy as ordinary imperial citizens found themselves touched by divine power in ways that transcended the traditional structures of the imperial faith. The number of verified living saints had tripled in the past year, and the rate was accelerating as the Emperor God's influence continued to grow. On the forge world of Lucius, Tech Dominus Kell watched in amazement as the ancient webway gates that had been sealed since the heresy began responding to commands that came from no human source. The massive archways, carved from materials that predated the Imperium by millions of years, blazed with golden light as divine will overwrote 10,000 years of accumulated damage and neglect. "The sacred pathways are reopening," he transmitted to his fellow tech priests, his augmented voice carrying overtones of religious ecstasy that his emotional dampeners couldn't entirely suppress. "But they are not the same as they were. The Omnissiah has claimed them, remade them according to patterns of perfection that surpass even ancient Eldar construction." The first test transport to pass through the reactivated gate emerged at its destination, with reports that defied every scientific principle Kell understood. The journey that should have taken weeks through normal warp travel had been completed in hours, with no exposure to the chaotic energies of the immaterium. More importantly, the crew reported that the passage had felt like being cradled in divine light, protected by a presence so vast and benevolent that it had brought many of them to tears. "Begin preparations for expanded gate activation," Kell commanded, though part of his rational mind rebelled at the implications. If the Emperor God could command the webway network directly, it meant that humanity now had access to a form of interstellar travel that was not only faster than warp transit, but completely safe from chaos corruption. The implications for the scattered human polities that had emerged from the Imperium's fragmentation were staggering. Worlds that had been cut off for months could now be reached in days. Trade routes that had become too dangerous to traverse were suddenly safer than they had been during the height of Imperial power. In the depths of the Immaterium, the four Chaos Gods felt the Emperor God's growing influence as a physical pressure that threatened the very foundations of their realm. What had begun as an annoyance, a new deity whose presence disrupted their carefully balanced competition, had evolved into an existential threat that demanded coordinated response. His power grows with each mortal who acknowledges his divinity, Tzeentch reported to his brothers, his infinite capacity for planning focused on a single problem for the first time in eons. Every prayer offered in his name, every miracle performed in his service, every soul that finds comfort in his presence strengthens him at our expense. Khorne's response was characteristically direct. Then we crush him before he becomes too strong. Send every daemon, every champion, every drop of corrupted blood in our service. Drown his light in endless war. But even as the blood god spoke, all four of them could feel the futility of conventional assault against an entity that seemed to grow stronger with each attack. The Emperor God was not drawing power from the same sources that sustained them: base emotion, primal desire, fundamental corruption. He was sustained by something far more dangerous: organized faith given divine purpose, the collective will of a species that had chosen to transcend its limitations through voluntary submission to higher purpose. Nurgle's contribution carried the weight of eons. My beautiful plagues find no purchase in spaces touched by his light. Decay itself is reversed in his presence. He represents everything we are not: renewal instead of entropy, hope instead of despair, order instead of corruption. Slanesh's silence spoke volumes. The Prince of Pleasure had sent her most seductive servants against the new god's influence, offering temptations that had corrupted saints and broken the will of heroes. All of them had been simply ignored, not defeated or overcome, but dismissed as irrelevant by a will so focused on higher purpose that base desire couldn't even register as a distraction. The coordinated assault they launched was the greatest manifestation of chaos power since the galaxy's birth. Demon legions beyond counting poured through every breach and flaw in reality, while their mortal servants received visions that promised ultimate victory over the forces of order. For a brief moment, the warp itself seemed to turn inside out as the four gods focused their combined will on destroying the upstart deity who threatened their eternal dominion. The assault broke against the Emperor God's influence, like waves against an immovable shore. Every daemon that touched the golden light simply ceased to exist, not banished back to the warp, but completely unmade, as if they had never been. Every chaos cult that tried to perform rituals of summoning found their ceremonies disrupted by divine intervention that manifested as burning angels and voices that spoke words of such purity that they drove the cultists to their knees in repentance. Most devastatingly of all, the Emperor God began to push back. On the demon world of Medrengard, iron warriors who had served Chaos for 10 millennia felt their connection to the dark gods simply stop. Their demon engines fell silent, their warp-touched weapons became simple metal, and their augmentations that had been blessed by dark powers returned to purely technological function. Some fell to their knees and wept at the sudden absence of the corruption that had defined them for so long. Others raged against a universe that could simply withdraw the source of their power without explanation or recourse. Warsmith Honsu, veteran of countless campaigns against the Imperium, found himself looking up at a sky that had turned the color of burnished gold. For the first time in 10,000 years, the demon world that had served as his fortress showed glimpses of what it might have been before Chaos claimed it. A garden world where humans might have lived in peace, rather than a nightmare realm where only the damned could survive. "All forces," he commanded, through Vox channels that were somehow clear of the static that usually plagued Chaos communications. "Begin immediate evacuation. This world is lost to us." Similar scenes played out across 100 demon worlds as the Emperor God's influence pushed deeper into realms that had been claimed by Chaos since the galaxy's youth. It was not conquest in any conventional sense. There was no army, no invasion fleet, no military campaign. Simply the gradual expansion of divine order into spaces where only corruption had existed for eons. On the cemetery world of Krieg, a new generation was being born that would redefine humanity's relationship with the divine. The children conceived after the Emperor's apotheosis were different from their parents in ways that went far deeper than simple mutation or evolution. They were psychers, but not in the traditional sense. Their abilities were not chaotic or dangerous, but focused and purposeful, connected directly to the Emperor God's will, rather than the raw stuff of the warp. Tech Adept Korth 9, who had been studying the phenomenon since the first births were reported, watched in amazement as 5-year-old Marcus Voss demonstrated abilities that defied every principle of psychic science. The boy could heal minor injuries with a touch, communicate across vast distances without technological aid, and most remarkably, seemed to be in constant communion with a divine presence that granted him knowledge far beyond his years. "He knows things," the boy's mother explained to Korth 9, her voice carrying the mixture of pride and concern that marked every parent of these divine children. Not facts or information, but purposes. He told me yesterday that the Emperor God wanted us to prepare for visitors from the stars. Today, the first webway transport arrived. It was becoming clear that these children represented more than just a new generation of psychers. They were the beginning of humanity's transformation into something fundamentally different, a species that maintained direct connection with its divine patron, guided not by distant authority, but by immediate spiritual communion. The imperial cult itself was evolving to accommodate these new realities. Where once faith had been primarily a matter of ritual and doctrine, it was becoming something approaching magic in the most literal sense. Prayers were answered not metaphorically, but directly, with visible manifestations of divine power that could heal the wounded, strengthen the weak, and protect the faithful from harm. Ecclesiarch Deasis, who had struggled to maintain doctrinal unity in the months following the Emperor's apotheosis, found himself presiding over a faith that was growing beyond the need for institutional guidance. The faithful were receiving direct revelation from their God, and the traditional role of the ecclesiarchy as intermediary between humanity and the divine was becoming increasingly irrelevant. Perhaps He confided to Cardinal Vex during one of their regular theological discussions, "Our role is not to guide the faithful toward the Emperor God, but to help them understand what he is guiding them toward." It was a recognition that would reshape the imperial faith for millennia to come. The acknowledgement that when a god becomes actively involved in the affairs of mortals, the relationship between divine and human transforms in ways that no amount of doctrine or tradition can anticipate. Across the galaxy, humanity was discovering that their long centuries of faith had been rewarded beyond their wildest dreams. The God Emperor was no longer a distant figure requiring faith to sustain him. He was an active presence in their lives, a divine patron whose will could be felt directly, and whose protection was not merely spiritual, but immediate and practical. The age of faith as hope had ended. The age of faith as partnership with the divine had begun. Chapter 11. The New Golden Age. 3 years had passed since the Emperor's apotheosis, and Tech Dominus Kell stood before a sight that would have been dismissed as impossible heresy in the old Imperium. In the sacred forges of Lucius, STC templates were manifesting not through archaeological discovery or careful preservation, but through direct divine revelation. The machines themselves were speaking, their machine spirits infused with knowledge that came directly from the Omnissiah's ascended consciousness. "Pattern recognition confirmed," he transmitted to his assembled tech priests, his augmented voice carrying overtones of wonder that would have been purged by emotional dampeners in earlier times. "The Omnissiah grants us the Meridian-class battlecruiser template. Construction parameters exceed all known Imperial Navy specifications by factors of 3 to 7 across all performance metrics." The template that materialized in the forge's hololithic displays was beautiful in its mathematical perfection. A vessel design that incorporated technologies thought lost since the Dark Age, but refined and improved by 10,000 years of accumulated experience. It was not merely an ancient pattern recovered from some forgotten archive, but a new creation that represented the marriage of human ingenuity and divine inspiration. Around the galaxy, similar scenes were playing out as the Emperor God's influence manifested in increasingly direct ways. On forge worlds that had struggled for millennia to produce functional equipment with degraded templates, master artisans found themselves creating marvels that surpassed the legendary works of the Great Crusade. The quest for knowledge had ended not in discovery, but in direct communion with the source of all knowledge itself. On the Space Marine recruitment world of Baal, Chapter Master Dante received visitors whose presence would have been impossible just years earlier. They came bearing the Emperor God's direct mandate to establish new chapters, not through the laborious process of gene seed cultivation and decades-long training programs, but through divine intervention that could transform worthy candidates in a matter of days. "The gene seed sings," reported sanguinary priest Corbulo, his voice filled with the kind of awe that even Astartes rarely displayed. "Each sample resonates with divine purpose. The Emperor God shapes them according to patterns that surpass even our Primarch's original genetics." The candidates themselves were unlike any that Dante had seen in 3 centuries of service. They came not from the traditional recruitment worlds, but from across the galaxy, individuals who had been touched by divine visions and called to service by the Emperor God's direct will. Some were former Imperial Guards, who had distinguished themselves in battles against chaos. Others were ordinary citizens, whose faith had manifested in miraculous ways. All of them bore the mark of divine selection that no earthly authority could question. The new chapters being founded differed from their predecessors in fundamental ways. Where the old Astartes had been created through crude biological manipulation and psychological conditioning, these new warriors were forged through a process that married technology with divine intervention. Their enhanced abilities exceeded even the legendary prowess of the original legions, while their absolute loyalty to the Emperor God was not programmed, but freely chosen and divinely blessed. They understand their purpose on a level that goes beyond mere duty, Dante reported to the assembled chapter masters who had gathered to witness this unprecedented event. Each one knows not just what he is meant to do, but why it serves the greater harmony of humanity's destiny. In the webway tunnels that connected the galaxy's major population centers, Navigator Prime Joia Belisarius experienced travel that had become not just safer than normal warp transit, but safer than it had ever been during the height of the Great Crusade. The ancient Eldar pathways now pulsed with golden light that served as both navigation aid and protection against any remaining chaotic influences. The journey that once took weeks now requires mere hours, he transmitted to his house's scattered fleet elements, his third eye perceiving currents of divine energy that made traditional warp navigation seem primitive by comparison. But more than speed, we have certainty. There are no storms here, no predators, no possibility of temporal displacement or dimensional drift. The transformation of interstellar travel was having profound effects on the scattered human polities that had emerged from the Imperium's fragmentation. Worlds that had been effectively isolated for months could now receive supplies and communication within days. The regional confederations established by various space marine chapters and planetary governors were able to coordinate their efforts with an efficiency that surpassed the old Imperium even during its golden age. Most remarkably, the webway itself was expanding. New tunnels appeared regularly, connecting previously isolated systems and creating a transportation network that seemed designed according to some vast strategic plan that encompassed the entire galaxy. It was as if the Emperor God was personally redesigning the infrastructure of human civilization to support unprecedented growth and prosperity. On the agri-world of Demeter Prime, planetary governor Lysander Victus watched his world's transformation with amazement that bordered on disbelief. 3 years ago, Demeter had been a struggling frontier colony that barely produced enough food to feed its own population. Now it was exporting agricultural surpluses that could feed entire sectors, its yields increasing with each harvest as divine blessing manifested in the form of crops that grew with supernatural vigor. The soil itself has changed, reported Chief Botanist Elena Vorth, her scientific training struggling to categorize phenomena that defied conventional understanding. Chemical analysis shows composition identical to baseline imperial soil standards, but growth rates suggest some kind of enhancement that we cannot detect with any instruments. Victus nodded, though his attention was focused on reports coming in from across his world. Crime rates had fallen to effectively zero as divine influence seemed to inspire voluntary cooperation among the population. Disputes that once required judicial intervention were being resolved through spontaneous negotiation, guided by shared understanding of the Emperor God's will. Industrial accidents had become virtually unknown as workers found themselves instinctively aware of potential hazards. Perhaps, he confided to his aide, we are witnessing what humanity becomes when it lives under the direct guidance of a God who actually cares about its welfare. The transformation was not limited to human worlds. Across the galaxy, Xenos civilizations found themselves forced to adapt to a reality where humanity was no longer merely another galactic power, but a species with demonstrable divine patronage that manifested in increasingly obvious ways. On the Tau Empire's border worlds, ethereal Onva contemplated intelligence reports that challenged every assumption his people had made about their human neighbors. The The Monkey had always been viewed as a powerful but ultimately limited species, dangerous in their numbers and technology, but hampered by superstition and internal conflict. Now they displayed coordination and capabilities that suggested fundamental changes had occurred in their civilization. "The human expansion patterns have shifted," reported Commander Shadowsun from her forward observation posts. "They no longer fight each other. Resource allocation appears optimized according to principles we cannot determine. Most concerning, their technological advancement rate has increased by factors that our Earth-caste scientists refuse to calculate because the numbers appear impossible." Onva studied tactical displays that showed human forces achieving victory ratios that defied military science. Individual humans displayed capabilities that exceeded anything in Tau doctrine, while their coordination suggested communication methods that transcended known technology. Most disturbing of all, human settlements were expanding into regions that should have been uninhabitable, transforming hostile environments through methods that Tau science could not explain. "We must reconsider our expansion plans," he decided, though the words tasted bitter. "The humans are becoming something that we are not prepared to confront." Similar conversations were taking place in Craft World councils and Necron tomb complexes across the galaxy, as ancient civilizations grappled with the reality that humanity had transcended its previous limitations. The species that had once been dismissed as young and crude was demonstrating power that suggested divine intervention on a scale not seen since the war in heaven. In the eye of terror, the remnants of chaos forces that had once threatened to overwhelm the galaxy found themselves increasingly isolated and powerless. Demon incursions that had once been routine occurrences now failed to materialize, as the Emperor God's influence made large sections of real space actively hostile to chaotic manifestation. Abaddon the Despoiler, the War Master of Chaos, stood in the ruins of his fortress on Sycharis and contemplated reports that spoke of total strategic failure. Black crusades that should have carved swaths through Imperial space were being turned back by forces that seemed to anticipate his every move. Chaos cults that had operated for centuries were being discovered and purged with efficiency that suggested divine revelation rather than conventional intelligence gathering. "The slaves of the corpse god have found new strength," he admitted to his assembled champions, though the words felt like poison on his tongue. "Their prayers are answered not with empty promises, but with direct intervention that manifests in the material realm." The reports from his agents in Imperial space were becoming increasingly desperate. Chaos Space Marines found their equipment failing when exposed to concentrated Imperial faith. Demon princes discovered their powers waning in the presence of human populations that displayed genuine divine connection. Most devastating of all, some chaos forces were simply disappearing, their corruption cleansed by contact with the Emperor God's expanding influence. "We must withdraw deeper into the eye," Abaddon decided, though retreat was anathema to every instinct he possessed. "Let the young god consolidate his power. We shall wait for him to make mistakes, to show weakness. All gods eventually disappoint their worshippers." But even as he spoke, Abaddon could feel the changes taking place in the warp itself. The chaotic energies that had sustained him for 10 millennia were being systematically displaced by something that felt like the opposite of everything chaos represented. Not mere order, but harmony, purpose, and what could only be described as love made manifest. On Terra itself, the transformation was most complete. The world that had been ravaged by war and twisted by reality storms had been remade into something that transcended its previous glory. The Imperial Palace still stood in ruins, but those ruins now glowed with inner light that made them beautiful rather than tragic. gardens bloomed in spaces where daemon blood had once corrupted the soil, while the air itself seemed infused with energy that strengthened all who breathed it. Ecclesiarch Deasis stood in the cathedral of the Saviour Emperor, rebuilt not through conventional construction, but through divine will that had reshaped broken stone into architectural marvels and announced the establishment of a new imperial calendar. The old dating system, which had marked years since the emperor's ascension to the throne, would be replaced by one that acknowledged the transformation that had given humanity its divine patron. Let this year be marked as one Aiae, Anno Ascensionis, the first year of the Ascension, he declared to congregations across the galaxy through comm networks that carried his words with supernatural clarity. We mark not the death of our God Emperor, but his rebirth as something greater than any mortal throne could contain. The ceremony itself was attended by representatives from every human polity in the galaxy, brought together through webway travel that had made such gatherings routine rather than miraculous. They came not as subjects of a distant authority, but as citizens of a divine kingdom that encompassed every world where humans dwelt. Tech-Adept Korth 9, now bearing the title of Keeper of Sacred Chronometry, made the calculations that would synchronize the new calendar across hundreds of thousands of worlds. It was work that would have taken years using conventional methods, but divine inspiration allowed him to perceive temporal patterns that made precise coordination possible within days. "The mathematical harmonies are perfect," he reported to the assembled delegates. "Each world's rotational period aligns with solar cycles that create resonance patterns of supernatural beauty. The Emperor God does not merely rule, he composes reality itself according to principles of divine aesthetics." As the delegates departed to carry word of the new calendar to their worlds, they bore with them something more significant than mere administrative change. They carried the promise of a future where humanity's potential would be limited not by material constraints or political divisions, but only by the scope of their faith and the magnitude of their willingness to serve something greater than themselves. The new Golden Age had begun, and across the galaxy, humanity was discovering what it meant to live under the direct guidance of a God who had earned his divinity through the ultimate sacrifice, and who chose to use that power not for dominion, but for the elevation of the species that had given him birth. In the depths of space, alien intelligences that had slumbered since the galaxy's youth began to stir, drawn by the scent of change that promised either opportunity or threat beyond their previous understanding. The great game was about to enter a new phase, and all the players were being forced to recalculate their strategies in the light of humanity's divine transformation. Chapter 12. 10,000 years. Hence, in the depths of the warp, where time moved according to will rather than physics, the Emperor God contemplated the galaxy that had emerged from his sacrifice. 10,000 years had passed since the Golden Throne's failure, 10,000 years of transformation that had reshaped not just humanity, but the fundamental nature of galactic civilization itself. He had always known this moment would come. The Golden Throne had not failed. It had fulfilled its purpose, becoming the crucible in which mortal ambition was transformed into divine transcendence. For 100 centuries, he had endured the agony of slow dissolution, gathering the faith and prayers of his children into a reservoir of power that would make his apotheosis not just possible, but inevitable. The price, he reflected to the warp currents that carried his consciousness across the galaxy, was everything I was. The reward is everything humanity has become. In the material realm, the galaxy bore little resemblance to what it might have been. where canon history would have seen the 13th Black Crusade tear the galaxy in half, there was instead a period of unprecedented peace. Cadia still stood, its pylons now reinforced not by ancient technology alone, but by divine will that made the world itself anathema to chaos corruption. Castellan Creed's descendant, inheritor of a name that had become synonymous with unshakable defense, stood upon walls that gleamed with inner light and watched Abaddon's latest assault break against defenses that seemed to anticipate every strategy. The Warmaster of Chaos had launched 17 Black Crusades over the millennia, each one smaller and more desperate than the last, as his power base continued to erode. "He doesn't understand," Castellan Ursula Creed observed to her aide, watching Chaos forces retreat once again toward the Eye of Terror. "He keeps fighting the war that ended 10,000 years ago. We're not the Imperium anymore. We're something he was never equipped to face." Indeed, humanity's response to the Tyranid threat had demonstrated just how far they had evolved beyond their original limitations. When Hive Fleet Behemoth arrived at the galaxy's edge, it encountered not the scattered resistance that canon history would have provided, but a coordinated divine response that treated the Great Devourer as a manageable pest rather than an existential threat. Inquisitor St. Cryptman, his consciousness expanded by direct connection to the Emperor God's will, had detected the Hive Fleet's approach decades before first contact. The response was swift and devastating. Entire Space Marine chapters dedicated to anti-Tyranid warfare, worlds evacuated and turned into traps baited with false biomass, and most effectively, divine intervention that simply turned the hive mind's bioships against each other. "The Xenos devour worlds," he reported to the conclave of saints that had replaced the old Inquisition hierarchy. "But they cannot devour faith made manifest. Each ship that enters our space becomes a beacon that guides our weapons to perfect accuracy." The Great Devourer had been reduced to a handful of splinter fleets that posed no greater threat than ordinary pirates. The galactic-scale menace that should have consumed entire sectors had been neutralized through a combination of divine foresight and humanity's transformed capabilities. The Necrons presented a different challenge, one that required diplomacy rather than warfare. When Imhotep the Stormlord awakened to find the galaxy dominated by a species that had somehow achieved true divine patronage, his response was characteristic of his kind, pragmatic calculation rather than emotional reaction. "The young race has transcended its limitations," he transmitted to the assembled Necron overlords during the first galactic conclave in 60 million years. "They pose no threat to our ultimate goals, but they have achieved something that we lost. Perhaps accommodation serves our interests better than conquest." The resulting détente between humanity and the Necrons was unprecedented in galactic history. Ancient tomb worlds that awakened found themselves not in a galaxy ripe for reclamation, but in one where humanity offered trade agreements and mutual defense pacts. Some Necron dynasties rejected such overtures and found themselves facing the combined might of divine humanity and allied Xenos civilizations. Others discovered that cooperation offered benefits that conquest never could. The Tau Empire's expansion had been halted not through warfare, but through simple obsolescence. When humanity offered technologies that exceeded even the most advanced Tau innovations, trade agreements that benefited all parties, and diplomatic solutions to resource conflicts that eliminated the need for territorial expansion, the Tau found themselves questioning the fundamental assumptions of their greater good. The Monkey have achieved something that our finest ethereals did not believe possible, Aunvar's successor admitted during a private council session. They have created a society that fulfills the greater good more perfectly than we have ever managed, while maintaining individual freedom that we thought incompatible with collective harmony. The result was not conquest or subjugation, but gradual integration as Tau worlds chose to join the expanding human commonwealth rather than compete with it. The greater good had been achieved, but through inspiration rather than force. The Aeldari response was perhaps the most complex of all. Craftworld Ulthwe, led by Farseer Eldrad Ulthuan's successor, had foreseen the Emperor's apotheosis through visions that stretched back to the dark age of technology. When it finally occurred, they found themselves facing a choice between ancient pride and pragmatic survival. "We are the dying race," acknowledged Farseer Ivrain during the historic meeting on Terra, where the Inari delegation negotiated humanity's first formal alliance with Craftworld Eldar. "They are the ascending one. Our choice is not whether to ally with them, but whether to be consumed by pride or guided by wisdom." The alliance that emerged gave the Eldari access to webway travel under divine protection, journeys that no longer required them to fear Slaaneish's hunger or chaos corruption. In return, they shared millennia of accumulated wisdom about the galaxy's deeper mysteries, helping humanity understand the cosmic implications of their transformation. But the galaxy's newfound stability created challenges that no previous civilization had faced. With chaos weakened, Tyranids contained, Necrons pacified, and other Xenos either allied or marginalized, humanity found itself confronting threats that emerged from success itself. On the agri-world of Talon's Prime, Governor St. Marcus detected the first signs of what xenobiologists were calling reality fatigue, areas where the material universe began to show stress fractures under the weight of sustained divine intervention. The Emperor God's influence was reshaping physics itself, and not all of creation was adapting well to the transformation. "The natural cycles are becoming unnatural," he reported to Terra during one of the regular communion sessions that connected every human world to the divine consciousness, seasons that follow prayer patterns rather than orbital mechanics, crops that grow according to spiritual need rather than soil chemistry. We are becoming dependent on miracles for basic survival. It was a concern that had been growing throughout human space as divine intervention became so routine that normal technological and biological processes began to atrophy. Humans were evolving into something beyond their original nature. But the transition was not without its costs. The Emperor God's response came not as commands or corrections, but as gentle guidance that helped each world find its own balance between the miraculous and the mundane. He had learned, over 10 millennia of divine existence, that even gods must exercise restraint in their intervention if they wished their children to remain capable of growth. More concerning were the entities that had begun to stir in the deep void between galaxies. The Emperor's apotheosis had created ripples that extended far beyond the Milky Way, attracting attention from the intelligences that predated the current galactic cycle. They came not as conquerors or destroyers, but as observers seeking to understand how a young species had achieved what ancient civilizations had thought impossible. "They are curious," reported Navigator St. Belisarius, whose enhanced sight could perceive these distant watchers through dimensions that normal vision couldn't access. Not hostile, but evaluating, as if humanity's transformation represents some kind of test that we have either passed or failed, and they're trying to determine which. The arrival of these extragalactic observers forced humanity to confront questions about their role in the broader cosmos. Were they destined to be merely a successful local civilization, or did their transformation carry responsibilities that extended beyond their home galaxy. In the deepest meditation chambers of Terra, where the Emperor God's presence was strongest, he contemplated the philosophical implications of what he had become. Divinity, he had learned, was not merely a matter of power or worship. It was responsibility on a scale that mortal minds struggled to comprehend. "I have given humanity what it needed to survive," he reflected through consciousness that now spanned dimensions beyond material existence. But survival was never the goal. It was merely the first step toward something greater. The visions that came to him now showed possible futures that stretched millions of years into the galaxy's destiny. Humanity continued to evolve, guided by divine will, but free to choose their own path toward transcendence. Some timelines showed them becoming a race of ascended beings who served as shepherds for younger civilizations. Others revealed them transforming into something so far beyond their current nature that the word human became merely a historical curiosity. But all the futures shared certain constants. The Emperor God's influence had fundamentally altered the trajectory of galactic civilization. Where once there had been endless war and gradual entropy, now there was sustainable growth and expanding consciousness. The galaxy was becoming not just a place where life could exist, but where it could achieve its highest potential. The Golden Throne failed exactly as I intended, he admitted to the warp currents that carried his thoughts to the farthest reaches of space. My death was never the end of the plan. It was the plan's true beginning. 10,000 years of agony bought humanity, 10 million years of divine guidance. The mathematics were always clear. On Terra, in the rebuilt cathedral of the Saviour Emperor, Ecclesiarch Saint Dearchus led the galaxy's first formal celebration of the Apotheosis Millennium, the 10,000th anniversary of the Emperor's transformation. Representatives from every human world allied Xeno's civilization, and even some of the extragalactic observers attended the ceremony that marked humanity's emergence as the galaxy's dominant spiritual force. "We gather not to mourn what was lost," he proclaimed to congregations that spanned the galaxy through webway connections that had become as routine as breathing, but to celebrate what was gained. The death of a mortal emperor bought us the birth of an eternal God. The failure of a machine brought us the success of a species. The liturgy that followed was unlike anything in imperial history. Where once there had been desperate prayers to a distant deity, now there was joyous communion with a divine presence that participated directly in the celebration. The Emperor God spoke through every voice, was present in every heart, and manifested through every act of faith performed in his name. As the ceremony concluded and the galaxy's representatives departed for their home worlds, a new chapter in human history began. The transformation that had started with the Golden Throne's failure was complete, but the story it had begun would continue for as long as consciousness existed in the universe. In the deepest space between galaxies, ancient intelligences that had witnessed the birth and death of countless civilizations made their final assessments of humanity's transformation. Most departed, satisfied that they had observed something unprecedented, but not threatening to the cosmic order. A few remained, recognizing in humanity's apotheosis something that had implications beyond the mere success of a single species. The Emperor God's transformation represented proof that consciousness could transcend the limitations that had constrained life since the universe's birth. If humanity could achieve true divinity, then perhaps other species could as well. The galaxy had found peace, but the cosmos had gained new possibilities that would reshape existence itself in ways that even gods could not entirely foresee. 10,000 years had passed since the Emperor's death and rebirth. 10 million more stretched ahead, filled with potential that no mortal mind could fully grasp. The age of endless war was over. The age of infinite possibility had begun.